The New Machiavelli. Book the Third. The Heart of Politics by Herbert George Wells. Narrated by Peter Silverleaf. Chapter the First. The Riddle for the Statesman. 1. I have been planning and replanning, writing and rewriting this next portion of my book for many days. I perceive I must leave it raw-edged and ill-joined. I have learnt something of the impossibility of history. For all I have had to tell is the story of one man's convictions and aims and how they reacted upon his life, and I find it too subtle and involved and intricate for the doing. I find it taxes all my powers to convey even the main forms and forces in that development. It is like looking through moving media of changing hue and variable refraction at something vitally unstable. Broad theories and generalizations are mingled with personal influences, with prevalent prejudices, and not only colored but altered by phases of hopefulness and moods of depression. The web is made up of the most diverse elements, beyond treatment multitudinous. For a week or so I desisted altogether, and walked over the mountains and returned to sit through the warm, soft mornings among the shaded rocks above this little perched-up house of ours, discussing my difficulties with Isabel and I think, on the whole, complicating them further in the effort to simplify them to manageable and stateable elements. Let me nevertheless attempt a rough preliminary analysis of this confused process. A main strand is quite easily traceable. This main strand is the story of my obvious life, my life as it must have looked to most of my acquaintances. It presents you with a young couple, bright, hopeful, and energetic, starting out under Altiora's auspices to make a career. You figure us well-dressed and active, running about in motor cars, visiting in great people's houses, dining amidst brilliant companies, going to the theatre, meeting in the lobby. Margaret wore hundreds of beautiful dresses. We must have had an air of succeeding meritoriously during that time. We did very continually and faithfully serve our joint career. I thought about it a great deal, and did and refrained from doing 10,000 things for the sake of it. I kept up a solicitude for it, as it were by inertia, long after things had happened and changes occurred in me that rendered its completion impossible. Under certain very artless pretenses, we wanted steadfastly to make a handsome position in the world, achieve respect, succeed. Enormous unseen changes had been in progress for years in my mind, and the realities of my life before our general circle could have had any inkling of their existence or suspected the appearances of our life. Then suddenly our proceedings began to be deflected, our outward unanimity visibly strained and marred by the insurgence of these so long hidden developments. That career had its own hidden side, of course, but when I write of these unseen factors, I do not mean that but something altogether broader. I do not mean the everyday pettinesses which gave the cynical observer scope and told of a narrower, baser aspect of the fair but limited ambitions of my ostensible self. This sub-careerist element noted little things that affected the career, made me suspicious of the rivalry of so-and-so, propitiatory to so-and-so, whom, as a matter of fact, I didn't respect or feel in the least sympathetic towards, guarded with that man who, for all his charm and interest, wasn't helpful, and a little touchy at the appearance of neglect from that. No, I mean something greater and not something smaller when I write of a hidden life. In the ostensible self who glowed under the approbation of Altiora Bailey, and was envied and discussed, praised and depreciated, in the house and in smoking-room gossip, you really have as much of a man as usually figures in a novel or an obituary notice. But I am tremendously impressed now in the retrospect by the realization of how little that frontage represented me, and just how little such frontages do represent the complexities of the intelligent contemporary. Behind it, yet struggling to disorganize and alter it altogether, was a far more essential reality, a self less personal, less individualized and broader in its references. Its aims were never simply to get on. It had an altogether different system of demands and satisfactions. It was critical, curious, more than a little unfeeling, and relentlessly illuminating. It is just the existence and development of this more generalized self behind the frontage that is making modern life so much more subtle and intricate to render, and so much more hopeful in its relations to the perplexities of the universe. I see this mental and spiritual hinterland vary enormously in the people about me, from a type which seems to keep, as people say, all its goods in the window, to others who, like myself, come to regard the ostensible existence more and more as a mere experimental feeder and agent for that greater personality behind. And this back self has its history of phases, its crises and happy accidents and irrevocable conclusions, more or less distinct from the adventures and achievements of the ostensible self. It meets persons and phrases, it assimilates the spirit of a book, it is startled into new realizations by some accident that seems altogether irrelevant to the general tenor of one's life. Its increasing independence of the ostensible career makes it the organ of corrective criticism. It accumulates disturbing energy. Then it breaks our overt promises and repudiates our pledges, coming down at last like an overbearing mentor upon the small engagements of the pupil. In the life of the individual, it takes the role that the growth of philosophy, science, and creative literature may play in the development of mankind. 2. It is curious to recall how Britain helped shatter that obvious, lucidly explicable presentation of myself upon which I had embarked with Margaret. He returned to revive a memory of adolescent dreams and a habit of adolescent frankness. He reached through my shallow frontage, as no one else seemed capable of doing, and dragged that back self into relation with it. I remember very distinctly a dinner and a subsequent walk with him which presents itself now as altogether typical of the quality of his influence. I had come upon him one day while lunching with Somers and Sutton at the Playwrights Club, and had asked him to dinner on the spur of the moment. He was oddly the same curly-headed, red-faced ventriloquist, and oddly different, rather seedy as well as untidy, and at first a little inclined to make comparisons with my sleek successfulness. But that disposition presently evaporated, and his talk was good and fresh and provocative. And something that had long been straining at its checks in my mind flapped over, and he and I found ourselves of one accord. Altiora wasn't at this dinner. When she came, matters were apt to become confusedly strenuous. There was always a slight and ineffectual struggle at the end of the part of Margaret to anticipate Altiora's overpowering tendency to a rally and the establishment of some entirely unjustifiable conclusion by a coup de main, when, however, Altiora was absent, the quieter influence of the Cramptons prevailed. Temperance and information for its own sake prevailed excessively over dinner, and the play of thought. Good Lord, what bores the Cramptons were! I wonder I endured them as I did. They had all of them the trick of lying in wait conversationally. They had no sense of the self-exposures, the gallant experiments in statement that are necessary for good conversation. They would watch one talking with an expression exactly like peeping through bushes. Then they would, as it were, dash out, dissent succinctly, contradict some secondary fact, and back to cover. They gave one twilight nerves. Their wives were easier but still difficult at a stretch. They talked a good deal about children and servants, but with an air caught from Altiora of making observations upon sociological types. Lewis gossiped about the house in an entirely finite manner. He never raised a discussion. Nobody ever raised a discussion. He would ask what we thought of Evesham's question that afternoon, and Edward would say it was good, and Mrs. Willie, who had been behind the grill, would think it was very good, and then Willie, passing the branches, would say rather conclusively that he didn't think it was very much good, and I would deny hearing the question in order to evade a profitless statement of views in that vacuum, and then we would cast about in our minds for some other topic of equal interest. On this occasion Altiora was absent, and to qualify our young Liberal bleakness, we had Mrs. Millingham, with her white hair and a fresh mind and complexion, and Esmere. Willie Crampton was with us, but not his wife, who was having her third baby on principle. His brother Edward was present, and the Lewises, and of course the Bunting Harblows. There was also some other lady. I remember her as pale blue, but for the life of me I cannot remember her name. Quite early there was a little breeze between Edward Crampton and Esmere, who had ventured an opinion about the partition of Poland. Edward was at work then upon the 7th volume of his monumental Life of Kosciuszko, and a little impatient with views perhaps not altogether false, but betraying a lamentable ignorance of accessible literature. At any rate, his correction of Esmere was magisterial. After that there was a distinct and not altogether delightful pause, and then someone, it may have been the pale blue lady, asked Mrs. Lewis whether her aunt, Lady Carmixter, had returned from her rest and sun cure in Italy. That led to a rather anxiously sustained talk about regimen, and Willie told us how he had profited by the no-breakfast system. It had increased his power of work enormously. He could get through 10 hours a day now without inconvenience. "What do you do?" said Esmere abruptly. "Oh, no end of work. There's all the estate and looking after things. But publicly. I asked 3 questions yesterday, and for one of them I had to consult 9 books." We were drifting, I could see, towards Dr. Haig's system of dietary, and whether the exclusion or inclusion of fish and chicken were most conducive to high efficiency, when Britain, who had refused lemonade and claret and demanded Burgundy, broke out and was discovered to be demanding in his throat just what we young Liberals thought we were up to. "I want," said Britain, repeating his challenge a little louder, "to hear just exactly what you think you are doing in Parliament." Lewis laughed nervously and thought we were seeking the good of the community. "How?" "Beneficent legislation," said Lewis. "Beneficent in what direction?" insisted Britain. "I want to know where you think you are going." "Amelioration of social conditions," said Lewis. "That's only a phrase." "You wouldn't have me sketch bills at dinner." "I'd like you to indicate directions," said Britain, and waited. "Upward and on," said Lewis with conscious neatness, and turned to ask Mrs. Bunting Harblow about her little boy's French. For a time talk frothed over Britain's head, but the natural mischief in Mrs. Millingham had been stirred, and she was presently echoing his demand in lisping, quasi-confidential undertones. "What are Liberals doing?" when Esmere fell in with the revolutionaries. To begin with, I was a little shocked by this clamour for fundamentals, and a little disconcerted. I had the experience that I suppose comes to everyone at times of discovering oneself together with 2 different sets of people with whom one has maintained 2 different sets of attitudes. It had always been, I perceived, an instinctive suppression in our circle that we shouldn't be more than vague about our political ideals. It had almost become part of my morality to respect this convention. It was understood we were all working hard and keeping ourselves fit, tremendously fit, under Altiora's inspiration, pro bono publico. Bunting Harblow had his under-secretaryship, and Lewis was on the verge of the cabinet, and these things we considered to be the nature of confirmations. It added to the discomfort of the situation that these plunging inquiries were being made in the presence of our wives. The rebel section of our party forced the talk. Edward Crampton was presently declaring, I forget in what relation, "The country is with us." My long-controlled hatred of the Cramptons' stereotyped phrases about the country and the house got the better of me. I showed my cloven hoof to my friends for the first time. "We don't respect the country as we used to do," I said. "We haven't the same belief we used to have in the will of the people. It's no good, Crampton, trying to keep that up. We Liberals know, as a matter of fact, nowadays, everyone knows, that the monster that brought us into power has, among other deficiencies, no head. We've got to give it one, if possible, with brains and a will. That lies in the future. For the present, if the country is with us, it means merely that we happen to have hold of its tether." Lewis was shocked. A mandate from the country was sacred to his system of pretences. Britain wasn't subdued by his first rebuff. Presently he was at us again. There were several attempts to check his outbreak of interrogation. I remember the Cramptons asked questions about the welfare of various cousins of Lewis who were unknown to the rest of us, and Margaret tried to engage Britain in a sympathetic discussion of the Arts and Crafts exhibition. But Britain and Esmere were persistent. Mrs. Millingham was mischievous, and in the end our rising hopes of young liberalism took to their thickets for good, while we talked over them of the prevalent vacuity of political intentions. Margaret was perplexed by me. It is only now I perceive just how perplexing I must have been. Of course, she said, with that faint stress of apprehension in her eyes, one must have aims, and it isn't always easy to put everything into phrases. Don't be so long, said Mrs. Edward Crampton to her husband as the wives trooped out. And afterwards, when we went upstairs, I had an indefinable persuasion that the ladies had been criticising Britain's share in our talk in an altogether unfavourable spirit. Mrs. Edward evidently thought him aggressive and impertinent, and Margaret, with a quiet firmness that brooked no resistance, took him at once into a corner and showed him Italian photographs by Coburn. We dispersed early. I walked with Britain along the Chelsea back streets towards Battersea Bridge. He lodged on the south side. Mrs. Millingham's a dear, he began. She's a dear. I liked her demand for a hansom because a four-wheeler was too safe. She was worked up, I said. She's a woman of faultless character, but her instincts, as Altiora would say, are anarchistic when she gives them a chance. So she takes it out in hansom cabs. Hansom cabs. She's wise, said Britain. I hope, Remington, he went on after a pause, I didn't rag your other guests too much. I've a sort of feeling at moments, Remington, those chaps are so infernally not bloody. It's part of a man's duty sometimes at least to eat red beef and get drunk. How is he to understand government if he doesn't? It scares me to think of your lot, by a sort of misapprehension, being in power. A kind of neuralgia in the head by way of government. I don't understand where you come in. Those others, they've no lusts. Their ideal is anemia. You and I, we had at least a lust to take hold of life and make something of it. They want to take hold of life and make nothing of it. They want to cut out all the stimulants, just as though life was anything but a reaction to stimulation. He began to talk of his own life. He had had ill fortune through most of it. He was poor and unsuccessful, and a girl he had been very fond of had been attacked and killed by a horse in a field in a very horrible manner. These things had wounded and tortured him, but they hadn't broken him. They had, it seemed to me, made a kind of crippled and ugly demigod of him. He was, I began to perceive, so much better than I had any right to expect. At first I had been rather struck by his unkempt look, and it made my reaction all the stronger. There was about him something, a kind of raw and bleeding faith in the deep things of life, that stirred me profoundly as he showed it. My set of people had irritated him and disappointed him. I discovered at his touch how they irritated him. He reproached me boldly. He made me feel ashamed of my easy acquiescences as I walked in my sleek tall neatness beside his rather old coat, his rather battered hat, his sturdier short shape, and listened to his denunciations of our self-satisfied new liberalism and progressivism. It has the same relation to progress, the reality of progress, that the things they paint on door panels in the suburbs have to art and beauty. There's a sort of filiation. Your Altiora's just the political equivalent of the ladies who sell traced cloth for embroidery. She's a dealer in refined social reform for the parlour. The real progress, Remington, is a graver thing and a painfuller thing and a slower thing altogether. Look, that. And he pointed to where, under a boarding in the light of a gas lamp, a dingy prostitute stood lurking. Was in Babylon and Nineveh. Your little lot make believe they won't be anything of the sort after this Parliament. They're going to vanish at a few top notes from Altiora Bailey, Remington. It's foolery. It's prigs at play. It's make-believe, make-believe. Your people there haven't got hold of things, aren't beginning to get hold of things, don't know anything of life at all, shirk life, avoid life. Get in little bright, clean rooms and talk big over your bumpers of lemonade while the night goes by outside untouched. Those Crampton fools think by all this," he waved at the woman again, "pretend it doesn't exist or is going to be banished root and branch by an act to keep children in the wet outside public houses. Do you think they really care, Remington? I don't. It's make-believe. What they want to do, what Lewis wants to do, what Mrs. Bunting Harblow wants her husband to do, is to sit and feel very grave and necessary and respected on the government benches. They think of putting their feet out like statesmen and tilting shiny hats with becoming brims down over their successful noses. Presentation portrait to a club at 50. That's their reality. That's their scope. They don't, it's manifest, want to think beyond that. The things there are, Revington, they'll never face. The wonder and the depth of life, lust and the night sky, pain. But the good intention, I pleaded, the goodwill. Sentimentality, said Britain. No goodwill is anything but dishonesty unless it frets and burns and hurts and destroys a man. That a lot of yours have nothing but a goodwill to think they have goodwill. Do you think they lie awake of nights searching their hearts as we do? Lewis, Crampton, or those neat, admiring, satisfied little wives? See how they shrank from the probe? We all, I said, shrink from the probe. God help us, said Britain. We are but vermin at the best, Remington, he broke out, and the greatest saint only a worm that has lifted its head for a moment from the dust. We are damned, we are meant to be damned, coral animalculi, building upward, upward in a sea of damnation. But of all the damned things that ever were damned, your damned, shirking, temperate, sham-efficient, self-satisfied, respectable, make-believe, Fabian-spirited young liberal is the utter damnedest. He paused for a moment and resumed in an entirely different note. Which is why I was so surprised, Remington, to find you in this set. You're just the old plunger you used to be, Britain, I said. You're going too far with all your might for the sake of the dams, like a donkey that drags its cart up a bank to get thistles. There's depths in liberalism. We were talking about liberals. Liberty! What does your little lot know of liberty? It waits outside, too big for our understanding, like the night and the stars. And lust, Remington, lust and bitterness. Don't I know them? With all the sweetness and hope of life bitten and trampled, the dear eyes and the brain that loved and understood, and my poor mumble of a life going on, I am within a sight of being a drunkard, Remington. I'm a failure by most standards. Life has cut me to the bone. But I'm not afraid of it any more. I've paid something of the price. I've seen something of the meaning. He flew off at a tangent. I'd rather die in delirium tremens, he cried, than be a Crampton or a Lewis. Make-believe, make-believe. The phrase and Britain's squat gestures haunted me as I walked homeward. I went to my room and stood before my desk and surveyed papers and files and Margaret's admirable equipment of me. I perceived, in the lurid light of Britain's suggestions, that so it was Mr. George Alexander would have mounted a statesman's private room. 3. I was never at any stage a loyal party man. I doubt if party will ever be the force it was during the 18th and 19th centuries. Men are becoming increasingly constructive and selective, less patient under tradition and the bondage of initial circumstances. As education becomes more universal and liberating, men will sort themselves more and more by their intellectual temperaments and less by their accidental associations. The past will rule them less, the future more. It is not simply party but school and college and county and country that lose their glamour. One does not hear nearly as much as our forefathers did of the old Harrovian, old Arvonian, old Etonian, claim to this or that unfair advantage or unearned sympathy. Even the Scotch and the Devonians weaken a little in their clannishness. A widening sense of fair play destroys such things. They follow Freemasonry down, Freemasonry of which one is chiefly reminded nowadays in England by propitiatory symbols outside shady public houses. There is, of course, a type of man which clings very obstinately to party ties. These are the men with strong reproductive imaginations and no imaginative initiative. Such men as Cladingbowl, for example, or Dayton. They are the scholars at large in life. For them, the fact that the party system has been essential in the history of England for 200 years gives it an overwhelming glamour. They have read histories and memoirs. They see the great pile of Westminster not so much for what it is as for what it was, rich with dramatic memories, populous with glorious ghosts, phrasing itself inevitably in anecdotes and quotations. It seems almost scandalous that new things should continue to happen, swamping with strange qualities the savour of these old associations. That Mr. Ramsay MacDonald should walk through Westminster Hall, thrust himself, it may be, through the very piece of space that once held Charles the Martyr pleading for his life, seems horrible profanation to Dayton, a last posthumous outrage. And he would, I think, like to have the front benches left empty now forever, or at most adorned with laurated ivory tablets. Here Dizzy sat, and on this spot William Ewart Gladstone made his first budget speech. Failing this, he demands, if only as signs of modesty and respect on the part of the survivors, meticulous imitation. Mr. G, he murmurs, would not have done that, and laments a vanished subtlety even while Mr. Evesham is speaking. He is always gloomily disposed to lapse into wonderings about what things are coming to, wonderings that have no grain of curiosity. His conception of perfect conduct is industrious persistence along the worn-down, well-marked grooves of the great recorded days. So infinitely more important to him is the documented, respected thing than the elusive present. Cladingbowl and Dayton do not shine in the House, though Cladingbowl is a sound man on a committee, and Dayton keeps the Old Country Gazette, the most gentlemanly paper in London. They prevail, however, in their clubs at lunchtime. There, with the pleasant consciousness of a morning's work free from either zeal or shirking, they mingle with permanent officials, prominent lawyers, even a few of the soberer type of businessmen, and relax their minds in the discussion of the morning paper, of the architecture of the West End, and of the latest public appointments, of golf, of holiday resorts, of the last judicial witticisms and forensic crushes. The New Year and birthday honours lists are always very sagely and exhaustively considered, and anecdotes are popular and keenly judged. They do not talk of things that are really active in their minds, but in the formal and habitual manner they suppose to be proper to intelligent but still honourable men. Socialism, individual money matters, and religion are forbidden topics, and sex and women only in so far as they appear in the law courts. It is to me the strangest of conventions, this assumption of unreal loyalties and traditional respects, this repudiation and concealment of passionate interests. It is like wearing gloves in summer fields, or bathing in a gown, or falling in love with the heroine of a novel, or writing under a pseudonym, or becoming a masked Tuareg. It is not, I think, that men of my species are insensitive to the great past that is embodied in Westminster and its traditions. We are not so much wanting in the historical sense as alive to the greatness of our present opportunities and the still vaster future that is possible to us. London is the most interesting, beautiful, and wonderful city in the world to me, delicate in her incidental and multitudinous littleness, and stupendous in her pregnant totality. I cannot bring myself to use her as a museum or an old bookshop. When I think of Whitehall, that little affair on the scaffold outside the banqueting hall seems trivial and remote in comparison with the possibilities that offer themselves to my imagination within the great grey government buildings close at hand. It gives me a qualm of nostalgia even to name those places now. I think of St. Stephen's Tower streaming upwards into the misty London night, and the great wet quadrangle of New Palace Yard, from which the hansom cabs of my first experiences were ousted more and more by taxicabs as the second Parliament of King Edward VII aged. I think of the Admiralty and War Office with their tall Marconi masts, sending out invisible threads of direction to the armies in the camps, to great fleets about the world. The crowded, darkly shining river goes flooding through my memory once again, onto those narrow seas that part us from our rival nations. I see quadrangles and corridors of spacious grey-toned offices in which undistinguished little men and little files of papers link us to islands in the tropics, to frozen wildernesses gashed for gold, to vast temple-studded plains, to forest worlds and mountain worlds, to ports and fortresses and lighthouses and watchtowers and grazing lands and cornlands all about the globe. Once more I traverse Victoria Street, grimy and dark, where the agents of the Empire jostle one another, pass the big embassies in the West End with their flags and scutcheons, follow the broad avenue that leads to Buckingham Palace, witness the coming and going of troops and officials and guests along it from every land on earth. Interwoven in the texture of it all, mocking, perplexing, stimulating beyond measure, is the gleaming consciousness, the challenging knowledge. You and your kind might still, if you could but grasp it here, mould all the destiny of man. 4. My first 3 years in Parliament were years of active discontent. The little group of younger Liberals to which I belonged was very ignorant of the traditions and qualities of our older leaders and quite out of touch with the mass of the party. For a time, Parliament was enormously taken up with the moribund issues and old quarrels. The early educational legislation was sectarian and unenterprising, and the licensing bill went little further than the attempted rectification of a conservative mistake. I was altogether for the nationalisation of the public houses, and of this end the bill gave no intimations. It was just beer-baiting. I was recalcitrant almost from the beginning, and spoke against the government so early as the second reading of the first education bill, the one the Lords rejected in 1906. I went a little beyond my intention in the heat of speaking. It is a way with inexperienced man. I called the bill timid, narrow, a mere sop to the jealousies of sects and little-minded people. I contrasted its aim and methods with the manifest needs of the time. I am not a particularly good speaker. After the manner of a writer, I worry to find my meaning too much, but this was one of my successes. I spoke after dinner and to a fairly full house, for people were already a little curious about me because of my writings. Several of the Conservative leaders were present and stayed, and Mr. Evesham, I remember, came ostentatiously to hear me, with that engaging friendliness of his, and gave me, at the first chance, an approving "hear, hear." I can still recall quite distinctly my 2 futile attempts to catch the speaker's eye before I was able to begin. The nervous quiver of my rather too prepared opening, the effect of hearing my own voice and my subconscious wonder as to what I could possibly be talking about, the realization that I was getting on fairly well, the immense satisfaction afterwards of having on the whole brought it off, and the absurd gratitude I felt for that encouraging cheer. Addressing the House of Commons is like no other public speaking in the world. Its semi-colloquial methods give it an air of being easy, but its shifting audience, the comings and goings and hesitations of members behind the chair, not mere audience units but men who matter, the desolating emptiness that spreads itself round the man who fails to interest, the little compact, disciplined crowd in the stranger's gallery, the light, elusive, flickering movements high up behind the grill, the wigged, attentive, weary speaker, the table and the mace, and the chapel-like Gothic background with its sombre shadows, conspire together, produce a confused, uncertain feeling in me, as though I was walking upon a pavement full of trapdoors and patches of uncovered morass. A misplaced, well-meant "hear, hear" is apt to be extraordinarily disconcerting, and under no other circumstances have I had to speak with quite the same sideways twist that the arrangement of the House imposes. One does not recognize one's own voice threading out into the stirring room. Unless I was excited or speaking to the mind of some particular person in the house, I was apt to lose my feeling of an auditor. I had no sense of whither my sentences were going, such as one has with a public meeting well under one's eye. And to lose one's sense of an auditor is for a man of my temperament to lose one's sense of the immediate, and to become prolix and vague with qualifications. 5. My discontents with the Liberal Party and my mental exploration of the quality of party generally is curiously mixed up with certain impressions of things and people in the National Liberal Club. The National Liberal Club is liberalism made visible in the flesh and Daltonware. It is an extraordinary big club done in a bold, wholesale, shiny, marbled style, richly furnished with numerous paintings, steel engravings, busts, and full-length statues of the late Mr. Gladstone, and its spacious dining rooms, its long, hazy, crowded smoking room with innumerable little tables and groups of men in armchairs, its magazine room and library upstairs, have just that undistinguished and unconcentrated diversity which is, for me, the Liberal note. The pensive member sits and hears perplexing dialects and even fragments of foreign speech, and among the clustering masses of less insistent whites his roving eye catches profiles and complexions that send his mind afield to Calcutta or Rangoon or the West Indies or Sierra Leone or the Cape. I was not infrequently that pensive member. I used to go to the club to doubt about liberalism. About 2 o'clock in the day, the great smoking room is crowded with countless little groups. They sit about small round tables or in circles of chairs, and the haze of tobacco seems to prolong the great narrow place with its pillars and bays to infinity. Some of the groups are big, as many as a dozen men talk in loud tones, some are duologues, and there is always a sprinkling of lonely, disassociated men. At first one gets an impression of men going from group to group, and as it were linking them, but as one watches closely, one finds that these men just visit 3 or 4 groups at the outside, and know nothing of the others. One begins to perceive more and more distinctly that one is dealing with a sort of human mosaic, that each patch in that great place is of a different quality and colour from the next and never to be mixed with it. Most clubs have a common link, a lowest common denominator in the club bore, who spares no one, but even the National Liberal bores are specialised and sectional. As one looks round, one sees here a clump of men from the North Country or the Potteries, here an island of South London politicians, here a couple of young Jews ascendant from Whitechapel, here a circle of journalists and writers, here a group of Irish politicians, here 2 East Indians, here a priest or so, here a clump of old-fashioned Protestants, here a little knot of eminent rationalists indulging in a blasphemous story sotto voce. Next them are a group of anglicised Germans and highly specialised chess players, and then 2 of the oldest-looking persons, bulging with documents and intent upon extraordinary business transactions over long cigars. I would listen to a stormy sea of babblement and try to extract some constructive intimations. Every now and then I got a whiff of politics. It was clear they were against the Lords, against plutocrats, against Cossington's newspapers, against the brewers. It was tremendously clear what they were against. The trouble was to find out what on earth they were for. As I sat and thought, the streaked and mottled pillars and wall, the various views, aspects, and portraits of Mr. and Mrs. Gladstone, the partitions of polished mahogany, the yellow-vested waiters, would dissolve and vanish, and I would have a vision of this sample of miscellaneous men of limited, diverse interests and a universal littleness of imagination enlarged, unlimited, no longer a sample but a community, spreading, stretching out to infinity, all in little groups and duologues and circles, all with their special and narrow concerns, all with their backs to most of the others. What but a common antagonism would ever keep these multitudes together? I understood why modern electioneering is more than half of it denunciation. Let us condemn, if possible, let us obstruct and deprive, but not let us do. There is no real appeal to the commonplace mind in let us do. That calls for the creative imagination, and few have been accustomed to respond to that call. The other merely needs jealousy and bait, of which there are great and easily accessible reservoirs in every human heart. I remember that vision of endless, narrow, jealous individuality very vividly. A seething limitlessness it became at last, like a waste place covered by crawling locusts that men sweep up by the sackload and drown by the million in ditches. Grotesquely against it came the lean features, the sidelong shy movements of Edward Crampton, seated in a circle of talkers close at hand. I had a whiff of his strained, unmusical voice, and behold, he was saying something about the will of the people. The immense and wonderful disconnectedness of human life. I forgot the smoke and jabber of the club altogether. I became a lonely spirit flung aloft by some queer accident, a stone upon a ledge in some high and rocky wilderness, and below, as far as the eye could reach, stretched the swarming infinitesimals of humanity. Like grass upon the field, like pebbles upon the unbounded beaches. Was there ever to be in human life more than that endless struggling individualism? Was there indeed some giantry, some immense valiant synthesis still to come, or present it might be and still unseen by me, or was this the beginning and withal the last phase of mankind? I glimpsed for a while the stupendous impudence of our ambitions, the tremendous enterprise to which the modern statesman is implicitly addressed. I was, as it were, one of the little swarm of would-be reef-builders looking back at the teeming slime upon the ocean floor. All the history of mankind, all the history of life, has been and will be the story of something struggling out of the indiscriminated abyss, struggling to exist and prevail over and comprehend individual lives, an effort of insidious attraction, an idea of invincible appeal. That something greater than ourselves, which does not so much exist as seek existence, palpitating between being and not being, how marvellous it is! It has worn the form and visage of 10,000 different gods, sought a shape for itself in stone and ivory and music and wonderful words, spoken more and more clearly of a mystery of love, a mystery of unity, dabbling meanwhile in blood and cruelty beyond the common impulses of men. It is something that comes and goes, like a light that shines and is withdrawn so completely that one doubts if it has ever been. 6. I would mark with a curious interest the stray country member of the club up in town for a night or so. My mind would be busy with speculations about him, about his home, his family, his reading, his horizons, his innumerable fellows who didn't belong and never came up. I would fill in the outline of him with memories of my uncle and his Staffordshire neighbours. He was perhaps alderman this or councillor that, down there, a great man in his ward, J.P. within 7 miles of the boundary of the borough, and a god in his home. Here he was a nobody, and very shy, and either a little too arrogant or a little too meek towards our very democratic-mannered but still livened waiters. Was he perhaps the backbone of England? He overate himself lest he should appear mean, went through our special dinner conscientiously, drank, unless he was teetotal, of unfamiliar wines, and did his best, in spite of the rules, to tip. Afterwards, in a state of flushed repletion, he would have old brandy, black coffee, and a banded cigar, or, in the name of temperance, omit the brandy and have rather more coffee, in the smoking-room. I would sit and watch that stiff dignity of self-indulgence and wonder. An infernal clairvoyance would come to me. I would have visions of him in relation to his wife, checking always, sometimes bullying, sometimes being ostentatiously kind. I would see him glance furtively at his domestic servants upon his staircase, or stiffen his upper lip against the reluctant, protesting business employee. We imaginative people are base enough, heaven knows, but it is only in rare moods of bitter penetration that we pierce down to the baser lusts, the viler shames, the everlasting lying and muddle-headed self-justification of the dull. I would turn my eyes down the crowded room and see others of him and others. What did he think he was up to? Did he for a moment realize that his presence under the ceramic glory of a ceiling with me meant, if it had any rational meaning at all, that we were jointly doing something with the nation and the empire and mankind? How on earth could anyone get hold of him, make any noble use of him? He didn't read beyond his newspaper. He never thought, but only followed imaginings in his heart. He never discussed. At the first hint of discussion, his temper gave way. He was, I knew, a deep, thinly covered tank of resentments and quite irrational moral rages. Yet withal I would have to resist an impulse to go over to him and nudge him and say to him, "Look here, what indeed do you think we are doing with the nation and the empire and mankind? You know, mankind?" I wonder what reply I should have got. So far as any average could be struck, and so far as any backbone could be located, it seemed to me that this silent, shy, replete, sub-angry middle-class sentimentalist was, in his endless species and varieties and dialects, the backbone of our party. So far as I could be considered as representing anything in the House, I pretended to sit for the elements of him. Seven. For a time I turned towards the Socialists. They at least had an air of coherent intentions. At that time, socialism had come into politics again after a period of depression and obscurity, with a tremendous éclat. There was visibly a following of socialist members to Chris Robinson, mysteriously uncommunicative gentleman in soft felt hats and short coats and square-toed boots, who replied to casual advances a little surprisingly in rich North Country dialects. Members became aware of a sea-green incorruptible, as Colonel Marlowe put it to me, speaking on the address, a slender twisted figure supporting itself on a stick and speaking with a fire that was altogether revolutionary. This was Philip Snowden, the member for Blackburn. They had come in nearly 40 strong altogether, and with an air of presently meaning to come in much stronger. They were only one aspect of what seemed at that time a big national movement. Socialist societies, we gathered, were springing up all over the country, and everyone was inquiring about socialism and discussing socialism. It had taken the universities with particular force, and any youngster with the slightest intellectual pretension was either actively for or brilliantly against. For a time our young liberal group was ostentatiously sympathetic. When I think of the socialists, there comes a vivid memory of certain evening gatherings at our house. These gatherings had been organized by Margaret as the outcome of a discussion at the Baileys. Altiora had been very emphatic and uncharitable upon the futility of the socialist movement. It seemed that even the leaders fought shy of dinner parties. "They never meet each other," said Altiora, "much less people on the other side. How can they begin to understand politics until they do that?" "Most of them have totally unpresentable wives," said Altiora, "totally," and quoted instances. "And they will bring them, or they won't come. Some of the poor creatures have scarcely learnt their table manners. They just make holes in the talk." I thought there was a great deal of truth beneath Altiora's outburst. The presentation of the socialist case seemed very greatly crippled by the want of a common intimacy in its leaders. The want of intimacy didn't at first appear to be more than an accident, and our talk led to Margaret's attempt to get acquaintance and easy intercourse afoot among them and between them and the young liberals of our group. She gave a series of weekly dinners, planned, I think, a little too accurately upon Altiora's model, and after each we had as Catholic a reception as we could contrive. Our receptions were, indeed, I should think, about as Catholic as receptions could be. Margaret found herself with a weekly house full of insoluble problems in intercourse. One did one's best, but one got a nightmare feeling as the evening wore on. It was one of the few unanimities of these parties that everyone should be a little odd in appearance, funny about the hair or the tie or the shoes, or more generally, and that bursts of violent aggression should alternate with an attitude entirely defensive. A number of our guests had an air of waiting for a clue that never came, and stood and sat about silently, mildly amused but not a bit surprised that we did not discover their distinctive open sesames. There was a sprinkling of manifest seers and prophetesses in shapeless garments, far too many, I thought, for really easy social intercourse, and any conversation at any moment was liable to become oracular. One was in a state of tension from first to last. The most innocent remark seemed capable of exploding resentment, and replies came out at the most unexpected angles. We young Liberals went about puzzled but polite to the gathering we had evoked. The young Liberals' tradition is, on the whole, wonderfully discreet. Superfluous steam is let out far away from the house, in the Balkans or Africa, and the neat, stiff figures of the Cramptons, Bunting, Harblow, and Lewis, either in extremely well-cut morning coats indicative of the house, or in what is sometimes written of as faultless evening dress, stood about on those evenings, they and their very quietly and simply and expressively dressed little wives, like a datum line amidst lakes and mountains. I didn't at first see the connection between systematic social reorganization and arbitrary novelties in dietary and costume, just as I didn't realize why the most comprehensive constructive projects should appear to be supported solely by odd and exceptional personalities. On one of these evenings, a little group of rather jolly-looking pretty young people seated themselves for no particular reason in a large circle on the floor of my study, and engaged, so far as I could judge, in the game of Hunt the Meaning, the intellectual equivalent of Hunt the Slipper. It must have been that same evening I came upon an unbleached young gentleman before the oval mirror on the landing, engaged in removing the remains of an anchovy sandwich from his protruded tongue, visible ends of cress having misled him into the belief that he was dealing with doctrinally permissible food. It was not unusual to be given handbills and printed matter by our guests, but there I had the advantage over Lewis, who was too tactful to refuse the stuff, too neatly dressed to pocket it, and had no writing desk available upon which he could relieve himself in a manner flattering to the giver, so that his hands got fuller and fuller. A relentless, compact little woman in what Margaret declared to be an extremely expensive black dress has also printed herself on my memory. She had set her heart upon my contributing to a weekly periodical in the lentil interest with which she was associated, and I spent much time and care in evading her. Mingling with the more hygienic types were a number of anti-Puritan socialists, bulging with bias against temperance and breaking out against austere methods of living all over their faces. Their manner was packed with heartiness. They were apt to choke the approaches to the little buffet Margaret had set up downstairs, and there engage in discussions of determinism. It always seemed to be determinism, which became heartier and noisier, but never acrimonious even in the small hours. It seemed impossible to settle about this determinism of theirs, ever. And there were worldly socialists also. I particularly recall a large, active, buoyant, lady-killing individual with an eyeglass borne upon a broad black ribbon, who swam about us one evening. He might have been a slightly frayed actor in his large frock coat, his white waistcoat, and the sort of black and white check trousers that twinkle. He had a high-pitched voice with aristocratic intonations, and he seemed to be in a perpetual state of interrogation. "What are we all here for?" he would ask, only too audibly. "What are we doing here? What's the connection?" What was the connection? We made a special effort with our last assembly in June 1907. We tried to get something like a representative collection of the parliamentary leaders of socialism, the various exponents of socialist thought, and a number of young liberal thinkers into one room. Dorville came, and Horatio Bulch, Featherstone Hall, appeared for 10 minutes and talked charmingly to Margaret, and then vanished again. There was Wilkins the novelist, and Toomer and Dr. Tumpany. Chris Robinson stood about for a time in a new comforter, and Magdeburg, and Will Pipes, and 5 or 6 Labour members. And on our side we had our particular little group, Bunting, Harblow, Crampton, Lewis, all looking as broad-minded and open to conviction as they possibly could, and even occasionally talking out from their bushes almost boldly. But the gathering as a whole refused either to mingle or dispute, and as an experiment in intercourse the evening was a failure. Unexpected dissociations appeared between socialists one had supposed friendly. I could not have imagined it was possible for half so many people to turn their backs on everybody else in such a small room as ours. But the unsaid things those backs expressed broke out, I remarked, with refreshed virulence in the various organs of the various sections of the party next week. I talked, I remember, with Dr. Tumpany, a large young man in a still larger professional frock-coat, and with a great shock of very fair hair, who was candidate for some North Country constituency. We discussed the political outlook, and, like so many socialists at that time, he was full of vague threatenings against the Liberal Party. I was struck by a thing in him that I had already observed less vividly in many others of these socialist leaders, and which gave me at last a clue to the whole business. He behaved exactly like a man in possession of valuable patent rights, who wants to be dealt with. He had an air of having a corner in ideas. Then it flashed into my head that the whole socialist movement was an attempted corner in ideas. 8. Late that night I found myself alone with Margaret amid the debris of the gathering. I sat before the fire, hands in pockets, and Margaret, looking white and weary, came and leant upon the mantel. "Oh, Lord," said Margaret. I agreed. Then I resumed my meditation. "Ideas," I said, "count for more than I thought in the world." Margaret regarded me with that neutral expression behind which she was accustomed to wait for clues. "When you think of the height and depth and importance and wisdom of the socialist ideas and see the men who are running them," I explained, "a big system of ideas like socialism grows up out of the obvious common sense of our present conditions. It's as impersonal as science. All these men, they've given nothing to it. They're just people who have pegged out claims upon a big intellectual no-man's land and don't feel quite sure of the law. There's a sort of quarrelsome uneasiness. If we professed socialism, do you think they'd welcome us? Not a man of them. They'd feel it was burglary." "Yes," said Margaret, looking into the fire, "that is just what I felt about them all evening, particularly Dr. Tumpany." "We mustn't confuse socialism with the socialists," I said. "That's the moral of it. I suppose if God were to find he had made a mistake in dates or something and went back and annihilated everybody from Owen onwards who was in any way known as a socialist leader or teacher, socialism would be exactly where it is and what it is today, a growing realization of constructive needs in every man's mind and a little corner in party politics. So I suppose it will always be, but they were a damned lot, Margaret." I looked up at the little noise she made. "Twice," she said, smiling indulgently. "Today." Even the smile was Altiora's. I returned to my thoughts. They were a damned human lot. It was an excellent word in that connection. But the ideas marched on, just as though men's brains were no more than stepping stones, just as though some great brain in which we are all little cells and corpuscles was thinking them. "I don't think there is a man among them who makes me feel he is trustworthy," said Margaret, "unless it's Featherstone Hall." I sat, taking in this proposition. "They'll never help us, I feel," said Margaret. "Us? The Liberals." "Oh, damn the Liberals," I said. "They'll never even help themselves." "I don't think I could possibly get on with any of those people," said Margaret after a pause. She remained for a time looking down at me, and I could feel perplexed by me, but I wanted to go on with my thinking, and so I did not look up, and presently she stooped to my forehead and kissed me and went rustling softly to her room. I remained in my study for a long time, with my thoughts crystallizing out. It was then, I think, that I first apprehended clearly how that opposition to which I have already alluded of the immediate life and the mental hinterland of a man can be applied to public and social affairs. The ideas go on, and no person or party succeeds in embodying them. The reality of human progress never comes to the surface. It is a power in the deeps, an undertow. It goes on in silence while men think in studies, where they write self-forgetfully, in laboratories under the urgency of an impersonal curiosity, in the rare illumination of honest talk, in moments of emotional insight, in thoughtful reading, but not in everyday affairs. Everyday affairs, and whatever is made an everyday affair, are transactions of the ostensible self, the being of habits, interests, usage. Temper, vanity, hasty reaction to intimation, personal feeling are their substance. No man can abolish his immediate self and specialize in the depths. If he attempt that, he simply turns himself into something a little less than the common man. He may have an immense hinterland, but that does not absolve him from a frontage. That is the essential error of the specialist philosopher, the specialist teacher, the specialist publicist. They repudiate frontage, claim to be pure hinterland. That is what bothered me about Codger, about those various schoolmasters who had prepared me for life, about the Baileys and their dream of an official ruling class. A human being who is a philosopher in the first place, a teacher in the first place, or a statesman in the first place, is thereby and inevitably, though he bring godlike gifts to the pretense, a quack. These are attempts to live deep-side shallow, inside out. They produce merely a new pettiness. To understand socialism again is to gain a new breadth of outlook. To join a socialist organization is to join a narrow cult which is not even tolerably serviceable in presenting or spreading the ideas for which it stands. I perceived I had got something quite fundamental here. It had taken me some years to realize the true relation of the great constructive ideas that swayed me not only to political parties, but to myself. I had been disposed to identify the formulae of some one party with social construction, and to regard the other as necessarily anti-constructive, just as I had been inclined to follow the Baileys in the self-righteousness of supposing myself to be wholly constructive. But I saw now that every man of intellectual freedom and vigor is necessarily constructive-minded nowadays, and that no man is disinterestedly so. Each one of us repeats in himself the conflict of the race between the splendor of its possibilities and its immediate associations. We may be shaping immortal things, but we must sleep and answer the dinner gong, and have our salt of flattery and self-approval. In politics, a man counts not for what he is in moments of imaginative expansion, but for his common workday, selfish self, and political parties are held together not by a community of ultimate aims, but by the stabler bond of an accustomed life. Everybody almost is for progress in general, and nearly everybody is opposed to any change, except in so far as gross increments are change, in his particular method of living and behavior. Every party stands essentially for the interests and mental usages of some definite class or group of classes in the exciting community, and every party has its scientific-minded and constructive leading section, with well-defined hinterlands, formulating its social functions in a public-spirited form, and its superficial-minded following confessing its meanness and vanities and prejudices. No class will abolish itself, materially alter its way of life, or drastically reconstruct itself, albeit no class is indisposed to cooperate in the unlimited socialization of any other class. In that capacity for aggression upon other classes lies the essential driving force of modern affairs. The instincts, the persons, the parties, and vanities sway and struggle. The ideas and understandings march on and achieve themselves for all, in spite of everyone. The methods and traditions of British politics maintain the form of two great parties, with rider groups seeking to gain specific ends in the event of a small government majority. These two main parties are more or less heterogeneous in composition. Each, however, has certain necessary characteristics. The Conservative Party has always stood quite definitely for the established propertied interests. The landowner, the big lawyer, the established church, and latterly the huge private monopoly of the liquor trade, which has been created by temperance legislation, are the essential conservatives. Interwoven now with the native wealthy are the families of the great international usurers and a vast miscellaneous mass of financial enterprise. Outside the range of resistance implied by these interests, the Conservative Party has always shown itself just as constructive and collectivist as any other party. The great landowners have been as well disposed towards the endowment of higher education and as willing to cooperate with the Church in protective and mildly educational legislation for children and the working class as any political section. The financiers, too, are adventurous-spirited and eager for mechanical progress and technical efficiency. They are prepared to spend public money upon research, upon ports and harbours and public communications, upon sanitation and hygienic organization. A certain rude benevolence of public intention is equally characteristic of the liquor trade. Provided his comfort leads to no excesses of temperance, the liquor trade is quite eager to see the common man prosperous, happy, and with money to spend in a bar. All sections of the party are aggressively patriotic and favourably inclined to the idea of an upstanding, well-fed, and well-exercised population in uniform. Of course, there are reactionary landowners and old-fashioned country clergy, full of localized self-importance, jealous even of the cottager who can read, but they have neither the power nor the ability to retard the constructive forces in the party as a whole. On the other hand, when matters point to any definitely confiscatory proposal, to the public ownership and collective control of land, for example, or state mining and manufactures, or the nationalization of the so-called public house or extended municipal enterprise, or even to an increase of the taxation of property, then the Conservative Party presents a nearly adamantine bar. It does not stand for, it is, the existing arrangement in these affairs. Even more definitely a class party is the Labour Party, whose immediate interest is to raise wages, shorten hours of labour, increase employment, and make better terms for the working man tenant and working man purchaser. Its leaders are no doubt constructive-minded, but the mass of the following is naturally suspicious of education and discipline, hostile to the higher education, and, except for an obvious antagonism to employers and property owners, almost destitute of ideas. What else can it be? It stands for the expropriated multitude, whose whole situation and difficulty arise from its individual lack of initiative and organizing power. It favors the nationalization of land and capital with no sense of the difficulties involved in the process. But, on the other hand, the equally reasonable socialization of individuals, which is implied by military service, is steadily and quite naturally and quite illogically opposed by it. It is only in recent years that Labour has emerged as a separate party from the huge hospitable caravanserai of liberalism, and there is still a very marked tendency to step back again into that multitudinous assemblage. For multitudinous has always been the liberal characteristic. Liberalism has never been nor ever can be anything but a diversified crowd. Liberalism has to voice everything that is left out by these other parties. It is the party against the predominating interests. It is at once the party of the failing and of the untried. It is the party of decadence and hope. From its nature it must be a vague and planless association in comparison with its antagonist, neither so constructive on the one hand, nor on the other so competent to hinder the inevitable constructions of the civilized state. Essentially, it is the party of criticism, the anti-party. It is a system of hostilities and objections that somehow achieves at times an elusive common soul. It is a gathering together of all the smaller interests which find themselves at a disadvantage against the big established classes, the leasehold tenant as against the landowner, the retail tradesman as against the merchant and the moneylender, the nonconformist as against the churchman, the small employer as against the demoralizing hospitable publican, the man without introductions and broad connections against the man who has these things. It is the party of the many small men against the fewer prevailing men. It has no more essential reason for loving the collectivist state than the Conservatives. The small dealer is doomed to absorption in that just as much as the large owner, but it resorts to the state against its antagonists as, in the Middle Ages, common man pitted themselves against the barons by siding with the king. The Liberal Party is the party against class privilege because it represents no class advantages. But it is also the party that is on the whole most set against collective control because it represents no established responsibility. It is constructive only so far as its antagonism to the great owner is more powerful than its jealousy of the state. It organizes only because organization is forced upon it by the organization of its adversaries. It lapses in and out of alliance with Labour as it sways between hostility to wealth and hostility to public expenditure. Every modern European state will have in some form or other these three parties. The resistant, militant, authoritative, dull and unsympathetic party of establishment and success, the rich party, the confused, sentimental, spasmodic, numerous party of the small, struggling, various, undisciplined men, the poor man's party, and a third party sometimes detaching itself from the second and sometimes reuniting with it, the party of the altogether expropriated masses, the proletarians' Labour. Change Conservative and Liberal to Republican and Democrat, for example, and you have the conditions in the United States. The crown or a dethroned dynasty, the established church or a dispossessed church, nationalist secessions, the personalities of party leaders may break up, complicate, and confuse the self-expression of these three necessary divisions in the modern social drama. The analyst will make them out none the less for that. And then I come back, as if I came back to a refrain. The ideas go on, as though we are all no more than little cells and corpuscles in some great brain beyond our understanding. So it was I sat and thought my problem out. I still remember my satisfaction at seeing things plainly at last. It was like clouds dispersing to show the sky. Constructive ideas, of course, couldn't hold a party together alone. Interests and habits, not ideas. I had that now, and so the great constructive scheme of socialism, invading and inspiring all parties, was necessarily claimed only by this collection of odds and ends, this residuum of disconnected and exceptional people. This was true not only of the socialist idea, but of the scientific idea, the idea of veracity, of human confidence in humanity, of all that mattered in human life outside the life of individuals. The only party that would ever profess socialism was the Labour Party, and that in the entirely one-sided form of an irresponsible and non-constructive attack on property. Socialism in that mutilated form, the teeth and claws without the eyes and brains, I wanted as little as I wanted anything in the world. Perfectly clear it was, perfectly clear, and why hadn't I seen it before? I looked at my watch, and it was 2:30. I yawned, stretched, got up, and went to bed. 9. My ideas about statecraft have passed through 3 main phases to the final convictions that remain. There was the first immediacy of my dream of ports and harbours and cities, railways, roads, and administered territories, the vision I had seen in the haze from that little church above Locarno. Slowly that had passed into a more elaborate legislative constructiveness, which had led to my uneasy association with the Baileys and the professedly constructive young Liberals. To get that ordered life, I had realized the need of organization, knowledge, expertness, a wide movement of coordinated methods. On the individual side, I thought that a life of urgent industry, temperance, and close attention was indicated by my perception of these ends. I married Margaret and set to work, but something in my mind refused from the outset to accept these determinations as final. There was always a doubt lurking below, always a faint resentment, a protesting criticism, a feeling of vitally important omissions. I arrived at last at the clear realization that my political associates and I, in my association with them, were oddly narrow, priggish, and unreal. that the socialists with whom we were attempting cooperation were preposterously irrelevant to their own theories, that my political life didn't in some way comprehend more than itself, that rather perplexingly I was missing the thing I was seeking. Britain's footnotes to Altiora's self-assertions, her fits of energetic planning, her quarrels and rallies and vanities, his illuminating attacks on Cramptonism, and the heavy-spirited triviality of such liberalism as the Children's Charter, served to point my way to my present conclusions. I had been trying to deal all along with human progress as something immediate in life, something to be immediately attacked by political parties and groups pointing primarily to that end. I now began to see that just as in my own being there was the rather shallow, rather vulgar, self-seeking careerist who wore an admirable silk hat and bustled self-consciously through the lobby, and a much greater and indefinitely growing unpublished personality behind him, my hinterland I have called it, so in human affairs generally the permanent reality is also a hinterland, which is never really immediate, which draws continually upon human experience and influences human action more and more, but which is itself never the actual player upon the stage. It is the unseen dramatist who never takes a call. Now, it was just through the fact that our group about the Baileys didn't understand this, that with a sort of frantic energy they were trying to develop that sham expert officialdom of theirs to plan, regulate, and direct the affairs of humanity, that the perplexing note of silliness and shallowness that I have always felt and felt now most acutely under Britain's jibes came in. They were neglecting human life altogether in social organization. In the development of intellectual modesty lies the growth of statesmanship. It has been the chronic mistake of statecraft and all organizing spirits to attempt immediately to scheme and arrange and achieve. Priests, schools of thought, political schemers, leaders of men have always slipped into the error of assuming that they can think out the whole, or at any rate completely think out definite parts, of the purpose and future of man clearly and finally. They have set themselves to legislate and construct on that assumption, and, experiencing the perplexing obduracy and evasions of reality, they have taken to dogma, persecution, training, pruning, secretive education, and all the stupidities of self-sufficient energy. In the passion of their good intentions, they have not hesitated to conceal fact, suppress thought, crush disturbing initiatives and apparently detrimental desires. And so it is, blunderingly and wastefully, destroying with the making, that any extension of social organization is at present achieved. Directly, however, this idea of an emancipation from immediacy is grasped, directly the dominating importance of this critical, less personal, mental hinterland in the individual and of the collective mind in the human race is understood, the whole problem of the statesman and his attitude towards politics gain a new significance, and becomes accessible to a new series of solutions. He wants no longer to fix up, as people say, human affairs, but to devote his forces to the development of that needed intellectual life without which all his shallow attempts at fixing up are futile. He ceases to build on the sands and sets himself to gather foundations. You see, I began in my teens by wanting to plan and build cities and harbors for mankind. I ended in the middle 30s by desiring only to serve an increased general process of thought, a process fearless, critical, real-spirited, that would in its own time give cities, harbors, air, happiness, everything at a scale and quality, and in a light altogether beyond the match-striking imaginations of a contemporary mind. I wanted freedom of speech and suggestion, vigor of thought, and the cultivation of that impulse of veracity that lurks more or less discouraged in every man. With that I felt there must go an emotion. I hit upon a phrase that became at last something of a refrain in my speech and writings, to convey the spirit that I felt was at the very heart of real human progress: love and fine thinking. I suppose that nowadays no newspaper in England gets through a week without the repetition of that phrase. My convictions crystallized more and more definitely upon this. The more of love and fine thinking, the better for men, I said. the less the worse. And upon this fresh basis I set myself to examine what I as a politician might do. I perceived I was at last finding an adequate expression for all that was in me, for those forces that had rebelled at the crude presentations of Bromstead, at the secrecies and suppressions of my youth, at the dull unrealities of city merchants, at the conventions and timidities of the pinky-dinkies, at the philosophical recluse of Trinity, and the phrases and tradition worship of my political associates. None of these things were half alive, and I wanted life to be intensely alive and awake. I wanted thought like an edge of steel and desire like a flame. The real work before mankind now, I realized once and for all, is the enlargement of human expression, the release and intensification of human thought, the vivider utilization of experience, and the invigoration of research. And whatever one does in human affairs has or lacks value as it helps or hinders that. With that, I had got my problem clear, and the solution, so far as I was concerned, lay in finding out the point in the ostensible life of politics at which I could most subserve these ends. I was still against the muddles of Bromstead, but I had hunted them down now to their essential form. The jerry-built slums, the roads that went nowhere, the tarred fences, litigious notice boards and barbed wire fencing, the litter and the heaps of dump, were only the outward appearances whose ultimate realities were jerry-built conclusions, hasty purposes, aimless habits of thought, and imbecile bars and prohibitions in the thoughts and souls of men. How are we through politics to get at that confusion? We want to invigorate and reinvigorate education. We want to create a sustained counter-effort to the perpetual tendency of all educational organizations towards classicalism, secondary issues, and the evasion of life. We want to stimulate the expression of life through art and literature, and its exploration through research. We want to make the best and finest thought accessible to everyone, and more particularly, to create and sustain an enormous free criticism, without which art, literature, and research alike degenerate into tradition or imposture. Then all the other problems which are now insoluble, destitution, disease, the difficulty of maintaining international peace, the scarcely faced possibility of making life generally and continually beautiful, become easy. It was clear to me that the most vital activities in which I could engage would be those which most directly affected the Church, public habits of thought, education, organized research, literature, and the channels of general discussion. I had to ask myself how my position as Liberal member for King Hampstead squared with and conduced to this essential work. Chapter the 2nd. Seeking Associates. 1. I have told of my gradual abandonment of the pretensions and habits of party liberalism. In a sense, I was moving towards aristocracy. Regarding the development of the social and individual mental hinterland as the essential thing in human progress, I passed on very naturally to the practical assumption that we wanted what I may call hinterlanders. Of course, I do not mean by aristocracy the changing, unorganized medley of rich people and privileged people who dominate the civilized world of today, but as opposed to this, a possibility of coordinating the will of the finer individuals by habit and literature into a broad common aim. We must have an aristocracy, not of privilege, but of understanding and purpose, or mankind will fail. I find this dawning more and more clearly when I look through my various writings of the years between 1903 and 1910. I was already emerging to plain statements in 1908. I reasoned after this fashion. The line of human improvement and the expansion of human life lies in the direction of education and finer initiatives. If humanity cannot develop an education far beyond anything that is now provided, if it cannot collectively invent devices and solve problems on a much richer, broader scale than it does at the present time, it cannot hope to achieve any very much finer order or any more general happiness than it now enjoys. We must believe, therefore, that it can develop such a training and education, or we must abandon secular constructive hope. And here my peculiar difficulty as against crude democracy comes in. If humanity at large is capable of that high education and those creative freedoms our hope demands, much more must its better and more vigorous types be so capable. And if those who have power and leisure now and freedom to respond to imaginative appeals cannot be won to the idea of collective self-development, then the whole of humanity cannot be won to that. From that one passes to what one has become my general conception in politics. The conception of the constructive imagination working upon the vast complex of powerful people, clever people, enterprising people, influential people, amidst whom power is diffused today, to produce that self-conscious, highly selective, open-minded, devoted aristocratic culture which seems to me to be the necessary next phase in the development of human affairs. I see human progress not as the spontaneous product of crowds of raw minds swayed by elementary needs, but as a natural but elaborate result of intricate human interdependencies, of human energy and curiosity, liberated and acting at leisure, of human passions and motives modified and redirected by literature and art. But now the reader will understand how it came about that, disappointed by the essential littleness of liberalism and disillusioned about the representative quality of the professed socialists, I turned my mind more and more to a scrutiny of the big people, the wealthy and influential people, against whom liberalism pits its forces. I was asking myself definitely whether, after all, it was not my particular job to work through them and not against them. Was I not altogether out of my element as an anti? Weren't there big, bold qualities about these people that common men lack, and the possibility of far more splendid dreams? Were they really the obstacles? Might they not be rather the vehicles of the possible new braveries of life? 2. The faults of the imperialist movement were obvious enough. The conception of the Boer War had been clumsy and puerile, the costly errors of that struggle appalling, and the subsequent campaign of Mr. Chamberlain for tariff reform seemed calculated to combine the financial adventurers of the empire in one vast conspiracy against the consumer. The cant of imperialism was easy to learn and use. It was speedily adopted by all sorts of base enterprises and turned to all sorts of base ends. But a big child is permitted big mischief, and my mind was now continually returning to the persuasion that after all in some development of the idea of imperial patriotism might be found that wide, rough, politically acceptable expression of a constructive dream capable of sustaining a great educational and philosophical movement such as no formula of liberalism supplied. The fact that it readily took vulgar forms only witnessed to its strong popular appeal. Mixed in with the noisiness and humbug of the movement, there appeared a real regard for social efficiency, a real spirit of animation and enterprise. There suddenly appeared in my world, I saw them first, I think, in 1908, a new sort of little boy, a most agreeable development of the slouching, cunning, cigarette-smoking, town-bred youngster, a small boy in a khaki hat, and with bare knees and athletic bearing, earnestly engaged in wholesome and invigorating games up to and occasionally a little beyond his strength. The Boy Scout. I liked the Boy Scout, and I find it difficult to express how much it mattered to me, with my growing bias in favor of deliberate national training that liberalism hadn't been able to produce, and had indeed never attempted to produce anything of this kind. 3. In those days there existed a dining club called, there was some lost allusion to the exorcism of party feeling in its title, the Pentagram Circle. It included Bailey and Dayton and myself, Sir Herbert Thorns, Lord Charles Kindling, Minns the poet, Goebel the big railway man, Lord Gane, fresh from the settlement of Fromwire, and Rumbold, who later became Home Secretary and left us. We were men of all parties and very various experiences, and our object was to discuss the welfare of the empire in a disinterested spirit. We dined monthly at the Mermaid in Westminster, and for a couple of years we kept up an average attendance of 10 out of 14. The dinner time was given up to desultory conversation, and it is odd how warm and good the social atmosphere of that little gathering became as time went on. Then, over the dessert, so soon as the waiters had swept away the crumbs and ceased to fret us, one of us would open with perhaps 15 or 20 minutes' exposition of some specially prepared question, and after him we would deliver ourselves in turn, each for 3 or 4 minutes. When everyone present had spoken once, talk became general again, and it was rare we emerged upon Hendon Street before midnight. Sometimes, as my house was conveniently near, a knot of men would come home with me and go on talking and smoking in my dining room until 2 or 3. We had Fred Neal, that wild Irish journalist, among us towards the end, and his stupendous flow of words materially prolonged our closing discussions and made our continuance impossible. I learned very much and very many things at those dinners, but more particularly did I become familiarized with the habits of mind of such men as Neal, Krupp, Gain, and the 1 or 2 other new imperialists who belonged to us. They were nearly all like Bailey, Oxford men, though mostly of a younger generation, and they were all mysteriously and inexplicably advocates of tariff reform, as if it were the principal instead of, at best, a secondary aspect of constructive policy. They seemed obsessed by the idea that streams of trade could be diverted violently so as to link the parts of the empire by common interests, and they were persuaded, I still think mistakenly, that tariff reform would have an immense popular appeal. They were also very keen on military organization, and with a curious little martinet twist in their minds that boded ill for that side of public liberty. So much against them. But they were disposed to spend money much more generously on education and research of all sorts than our formless host of liberals seemed likely to do, and they were altogether more accessible than the young liberals to bold, constructive ideas affecting the universities and upper classes. The liberals are abjectly afraid of the universities. I found myself constantly falling into line with these men in our discussions, and more hostile to Dayton's sentimentalizing evasions of definite schemes and Min's trust in such things as the spirit of our people and the general trend of progress. It wasn't that I thought them very much righter than their opponents. I believe all definite party sides at any time are bound to be about equally right and equally lopsided. But that I thought I could get more out of them, and what was more important to me, more out of myself if I cooperated with them. By 1908, I had already arrived at a point where I could be definitely considering a transfer of my political allegiance. These abstract questions are inseparably interwoven with my memory of a shining long white table and our hock bottles and burgundy bottles and bottles of Perrier and Saint-Galmier and the disturbed central trophy of dessert and scattered glasses and nutshells and cigarette ends and menu cards used for memoranda. I see old Dayton sitting back and cocking his eye to the ceiling in a way he had while he threw warmth into the ancient platitudes of liberalism, and Minns leaning forward and a little like a cockatoo with a taste for confidences, telling us in a hushed voice of his faith in the destiny of mankind. Thorns lounges, rolling his round face and round eyes from speaker to speaker, and sounding the visible depths of misery whenever Neal begins. Gobolt and Gain were given to conversation in undertones, and Bailey pursued mysterious purposes in lisping whispers. It was Krupp attracted me most. He had, as people say, his eye on me from the beginning. He used to speak at me and drifted into a custom of coming home with me very regularly for an after-talk. He opened his heart to me. "Neither of us," he said, "are dukes, and neither of us are horny-handed sons of toil. We want to get hold of the handles, and to do that one must go where the power is and give it just as constructive a twist as we can. That's my Toryism." "Is it kindlings or Goebbels?" "No, but theirs is soft and mine's hard. Mine will wear theirs out. You and I and Bailey are all after the same thing, and why aren't we working together?" "Are you a Confederate?" I asked suddenly. "That's a secret nobody tells," he said. "What are the Confederates after?" Making aristocracy work, I suppose, just as I gather you want to do. The Confederates were being heard of at that time. They were at once attractive and repellent to me, an odd secret society whose membership nobody knew, pledged, it was said, to impose tariff reform and an ample constructive policy upon the Conservatives. In the press, at any rate, they had an air of deliberately organized power. I have no doubt the rumor of them greatly influenced my ideas. In the end, I made some very rapid decisions, but for nearly 2 years I was hesitating. Hesitations were inevitable in such a matter. I was not dealing with any simple question of principle, but with the elusive and fluctuating estimates of the trend of diverse forces and of the nature of my own powers. All through that period, I was asking over and over again, how far are these Confederates mere dreamers? How far, and this was more vital, are they rendering lip service to social organizations? Is it true they desire war because it confirms the ascendancy of their class? How far can conservatism be induced to plan and construct before it resists the thrust towards change? Is it really in bulk anything more than a mass of prejudice and conceit, cynical indulgence, and a hard suspicion of and hostility to the expropriated classes in the community? That is a research which yields no statistics, an inquiry like asking what is the ruling color of a chameleon. The shadowy answer varied with my health, varied with my mood and the conduct of the people I was watching. How fine can people be? How generous? Not incidentally, but all round. How far can you educate sons beyond the outlook of their fathers? And how far lift a rich, proud, self-indulgent class above the protests of its business agents and solicitors and its own habits and vanity? Is chivalry in a class possible? Was it ever indeed, or will it ever indeed be possible? Is the progress that seems attainable in certain directions worth the retrogression that may be its price? 4. It was the Pentagram Circle that I first broached the new conceptions that were developing in my mind. I count the evening of my paper the beginning of the movement that created the Blue Weekly, and our wing of the present new Tory party. I do that without any excessive egotism, because my essay was no solitary man's production. It was my reaction to forces that had come to me very large through my fellow members. Its quick reception by them showed that I was, so to speak, merely the first of the chestnuts to pop. The atmospheric quality of the evening stands out very vividly in my memory. The night, I remember, was warmly foggy when after midnight we went to finish our talk at my house. We had recently changed the rules of the club to admit visitors, and so it happened that I had brought Britton, and Krupp introduced Arnold Shoesmith, my former schoolfellow at City Merchants, and now the wealthy successor of his father and elder brother. I remember his heavy, inexpressibly handsome face lighting to his rare smile at the sight of me, and how little I dreamt of the tragic entanglement that was destined to involve us both. Gain was present, and Esmere, a newly added member, but I think Bailey was absent. Either he was absent, or he said something so entirely characteristic and undistinguished that it has left no impression on my mind. I had broken a little from the traditions of the club even in my title, which was deliberately a challenge to the liberal idea. It was, "The world exists for exceptional people." It is not the title I should choose now, for since that time I have got my phrase of mental hinterlander into journalistic use. I should say now, "The world exists for mental hinterland." The notes I made of that opening have long since vanished with 1,000 other papers, but some odd chance has preserved and brought with me to Italy the menu for the evening, its back black with the scrawled notes I made of the discussion for my reply. I found it the other day among some letters from Margaret and a copy of the 1909 report of the Poor Law Commission, also rich with penciled marginalia. My opening was a criticism of the democratic idea and method upon lines such as I have already sufficiently indicated in the preceding sections. I remember how old Dayton fretted in his chair and tushed and pished at that, even as I gave it, and afterwards we were treated to one of his platitudinous harangues, he sitting back in his chair with that small obstinate eye of his fixed on the ceiling and a sort of cadaverous glow upon his face, repeating, quite regardless of all my reasoning and all that had been said by others in the debate, the sacred empty phrases that were his soul's refuge from reality. "You may think it very clever," he said, with a nod of his head to mark his sense of his point, "not to trust in the people. I do," and so on. Nothing in his life or work had ever shown that he did trust in the people, but that was beside the mark. He was the party liberal, and these were the party incantations. After my preliminary attack on vague democracy, I went on to show that all human life was virtually aristocratic. People must either recognize aristocracy in general or else follow leaders, which is aristocracy in particular, and so I came to my point that the reality of human progress lay necessarily through the establishment of freedoms for the human best and a collective receptivity and understanding. There was a disgusted grunt from Dayton. Superman rubbish, Nietzsche, Shaw, ach. I sailed on over him to my next propositions. The prime essential in a progressive civilization was the establishment of a more effective selective process for the privilege of higher education and the very highest educational opportunity for the educable. We were too apt to patronize scholarship winners, as though a scholarship was toffee given as a reward for virtue. It wasn't any reward at all. It was an invitation to capacity. We had no more right to drag in virtue or any merit but quality than we had to involve it in a search for the tallest man. We didn't want a mere process for the selection of good as distinguished from gifted and able boys. No, you don't, from Dayton. We wanted all the brilliant stuff in the world concentrated upon the development of the world. Just to exasperate Dayton further, I put in a plea for gifts as against character in educational, artistic, and legislative work. Good teaching, I said, is better than good conduct. We are becoming idiotic about character. Dayton was too moved to speak. He slewed round upon me an eye of agonized aversion. I expatiated on the small proportion of the available ability that is really serving humanity today. I suppose today all the thought, all the art, all the increments of knowledge that matter are supplied so far as the English-speaking community is concerned by, how many? By 3,000 or 4,000 individuals. Less, said Thorns. To be more precise, by the mental hinterlands of 3,000 or 4,000 individuals. We who know some of the band entertain no illusions as to their innate rarity. We know that they are just the few out of many, the few who got in our world of chance and confusion, the timely stimulus, the apt suggestion at the fortunate moment, the needed training, the leisure. The rest are lost in the crowd, fail through the defects of their qualities, become commonplace workmen and second-rate professional men, marry commonplace wives, are as much waste as the driftage of superfluous pollen in a pine forest is waste. Decent, honest lives, said Dayton to his breadcrumbs, with his chin in his necktie. Waste. And the people who do get what we call opportunity get it usually in extremely limited and cramping forms. No man lives a life of intellectual productivity alone. He needs not only material and opportunity, but helpers, resonators. Round and about what I might call the real men, you want the sympathetic cooperators who help by understanding. It isn't that our salt of 3,000 or 4,000 is needlessly rare. It is sustained by far too small and undifferentiated a public. Most of the good men we know are not really doing the very best work of their gifts. Nearly all are a little adapted. Most are shockingly adapted to some second-best use. Now, I take it, this is the very centre and origin of the muddle, futility, and unhappiness that distresses us. It's the cardinal problem of the state, to discover, develop, and use the exceptional gifts of men. And I see that best done. I drift more and more away from the common stuff of legislative and administrative activity by a quite revolutionary development of the educational machinery, but by a still more unprecedented attempt to keep science going, to keep literature going, and to keep what is the necessary spur of all science and literature, an intelligent and appreciative criticism going. You know, none of these things have ever been kept going hitherto. They come unexpectedly and inexplicably. "Hear, hear," from Dayton, cough, nodding of the head, and an expression of mystical profundity. "They've lit up a civilization and vanished, to give place to darkness again. Now the modern state doesn't mean to go back to darkness again, and so it's got to keep its light burning." I went on to attack the present organization of our schools and universities, which seemed elaborately designed to turn the well-behaved, uncritical, and uncreative men of each generation into the authoritative leaders of the next, and I suggested remedies upon lines that I have already indicated in the earlier chapters of this story. So far, I had the substance of the club with me, but I opened a new ground and set Krupp agog by confessing my doubt from which party or combination of groups these developments of science and literature and educational organization could most reasonably be expected. I looked up to find Krupp's dark little eye intent upon me. There I left it to them. We had an astonishingly good discussion. Neil burst once, but we emerged from his flood after a time, and Dayton had his interlude. The rest was all close, keen examination of my problem. I see Krupp now with his arm bent before him on the table in a way we had, as though it was jointed throughout its length like a lobster's antenna, his plump, short-fingered hand crushing up a walnut shell into smaller and smaller fragments. "Remington," he said, "has given us the data for a movement, a really possible movement. It's not only possible, but necessary, urgently necessary, I think, if the empire is to go on." "We're working altogether too much at the social basement in education and training," said Gain. "Remington is right about our neglect of the higher levels." Britain made a good contribution with an analysis of what he called the spirit of a country and what made it. "The modern community needs its serious men to be artistic and its artists to be taken seriously," I remember him saying. "The day has gone by for either dull responsibility or merely witty art." I remember very vividly how Shoesmith harped on an idea I had thrown out of using some sort of review or weekly to express and elaborate these conceptions of a new, severer, aristocratic culture. "It would have to be done amazingly well," said Britton, and my mind went back to my school days and that ancient enterprise of ours, and how Cossington had rushed it. Well, Cossington had too many papers nowadays to interfere with us, and we perhaps had learnt some defensive devices. "But this thing has to be linked to some political party," said Krupp, with his eye on me. "You can't get away from that. The Liberals," he added, "have never done anything for research or literature." "They had a royal commission on the dramatic censorship," said Thorns, with a note of minute fairness. "It shows what they were made of," he added. "It's what I've told Remington again and again," said Krupp. "We've got to pick up the tradition of aristocracy, reorganize it, and make it work. But he's certainly suggested a method." "There won't be much aristocracy to pick up," said Dayton, darkly to the ceiling, "if the House of Lords throws out the budget." "All the more reason for picking it up," said Neil, "for we can't do without it." "Will they go to the bad, or will they rise from the ashes, aristocrats indeed, if the Liberals come in overwhelmingly?" said Britton. "It's we who might decide that," said Krupp insidiously. "I agree," said Gain. "No one can tell," said Thorns. "I doubt if they will get beaten." It was an odd, fragmentary discussion that night. We were all with ideas in our minds at once fine and imperfect. We threw out suggestions that showed themselves at once far inadequate, and we tried to qualify them by minor self-contradictions. Britain, I think, got more said than anyone. "You all seem to think you want to organize people, particularly groups and classes of individuals," he insisted. "It isn't that. That's the standing error of politicians. You want to organize a culture. Civilization isn't a matter of concrete groupings. It's a matter of prevailing ideas. The problem is how to make bold, clear ideas prevail. The question for Remington and us is just what groups of people will most help this culture forward." "Yes, but how are the Lords going to behave?" said Krupp. "You yourself were asking that a little while ago." "If they win or if they lose," Gain maintained, "there will be a movement to reorganize aristocracy, reform the House of Lords. They call it the political form of it." "Bailey thinks that," said someone. "The Labour people want abolition," said someone. "Let 'em," said Thorns. He became audible, sketching a possibility of action. Suppose all of us were able to work together. It's just one of those indeterminate, confused, eventful times ahead when a steady jet of ideas might produce enormous results. Leave me out of it, said Dayton, if you please. We should, said Thorns under his breath. I took up Krupp's initiative, I remember, and expanded it. I believe we could do extensive things, I insisted. Revivals and revisions of Toryism have been tried so often, said Thorns, from the Young England movement onward. Not one but has produced its enduring effects, I said. It's the peculiarity of English conservatism that it's persistently progressive and rejuvenescent. I think it must have been about that point that Dayton fled our presence after some clumsy sentence that I decided upon reflection was intended to remind me of my duty to my party. Then I remember Thorns firing doubts at me obliquely across the table. You can't run a country through its spoilt children, he said. What you call aristocrats are really spoilt children. They've had too much of everything except bracing experience. Children can always be educated, said Krupp. I said spoilt children, said Thorns. Look here, Thorns, said I. If this budget row leads to a storm and these big people get their power clipped, what's going to happen? Have you thought of that? When they go out, lock, stock and barrel, who comes in? Nature abhors a vacuum, said Krupp, supporting me. Bailey's trained officials, suggested Gain. Quacks with a certificate of approval from Altiora, said Thorns. I admit the horrors of the alternative. There'd be a massacre in 3 years. One may go on trying possibilities forever, I said. One thing emerges. Whatever accidents happen, our civilization needs, and almost consciously needs, a culture of fine, creative minds and all the necessary tolerances, opennesses, considerations that march with that. For my own part, I think that is the most vital thing. Build your ship of state as you will, get your men as you will. I concentrate what is clearly the affair of my sort of man. I want to ensure the quality of the quarterdeck. Hear, hear, said Shoesmith suddenly, his first remark for a long time. A first-rate figure, said Shoesmith, gripping it. Our danger is in missing that, I went on. Muddle isn't ended by transferring power from the muddle-headed few to the muddle-headed many, and then cheating the many out of it again in the interests of a bureaucracy of sham experts. But that seems the limit of the liberal imagination. There is no real progress in a country except a rise in the level of its free intellectual activity. All other progress is secondary and dependent. If you take on Bailey's dreams of efficient machinery and a sort of fanatical discipline with no free-moving brains behind it, confused ugliness becomes a rigid ugliness. That's all. No doubt things are moving from looseness to discipline, and from irresponsible controls to organized controls, and also, and rather contrariwise, everything is becoming, as people say, democratized. But all the more need in that for an ark in which the living element may be saved. Hear, hear, said Shoesmith, faint but pursuing. It must have been in my house afterwards that Shoesmith became noticeable. He seemed trying to say something vague and difficult that he didn't get said at all on that occasion. We could do immense things with a weekly, he repeated, echoing Neil, I think. And there he left off and became a mute expressiveness, and it was only afterwards, when I was in bed, that I saw we had our capitalist in our hands. We parted that night on my doorstep in a tremendous glow, but in that sort of glow one doesn't act upon without much reconsideration, and it was some months before I made my decision to follow up the indications of that opening talk. 5. I find my thoughts lingering about the Pentagram Circle. In my development it played a large part, not so much by starting new trains of thought as by confirming the practicability of things I had already hesitatingly entertained. Discussion with these other men so prominently involved in current affairs endorsed views that otherwise would have seemed only a little less remote from actuality than the guardians of Plato or the labour laws of More. Among other questions that were never very distant from our discussions, that came apt to every topic, was the true significance of democracy, tariff reform as a method of international hostility, and the imminence of war. On the first issue, I can still recall little Bailey, glib and winking, explaining that democracy was really just a dodge for getting assent to the ordinances of the expert official by means of the polling booth. If they don't like things, said he, they can vote for the opposition candidate and see what happens then. And that, you see, is why we don't want proportional representation, to let in the wild men. I opened my eyes. The lids had dropped for a moment under the caress of those smooth sounds to see if Bailey's artful forefinger wasn't at the side of his predominant nose. The international situation exercised us greatly. Our meetings were pervaded by the feeling that all things moved towards a day of reckoning with Germany, and I was largely instrumental in keeping up the suggestions that India was in a state of unstable equilibrium, that sooner or later something must happen there, something very serious to our empire. Dayton frankly detested these topics. He was full of that old Middle Victorian persuasion that whatever is inconvenient or disagreeable to the English mind could be annihilated by not thinking about it. He used to sit low in his chair and look mulish. Militarism, he would declare in a tone of the utmost moral fervour, is a curse. It's an unmitigated curse. Then he would cough shortly and twitch his head back and frown, and seem astonished beyond measure that after this conclusive statement we could still go on talking of war. All our imperialists were obsessed by the thought of international conflict, and their influence revived for a time those uneasinesses that had been aroused in me for the first time by my continental journey with Wellesley and by Meredith's One of Our Conquerors. That quite justifiable dread of a punishment for all the slackness, mental dishonesty, presumption, mercenary respectability, and sentimentalized commercialism of the Victorian period at the hands of the better organized, more vigorous, and now far more highly civilized peoples of Central Europe seemed to me to have both a good and bad series of consequences. It seemed the only thing capable of bracing English minds to education, sustained constructive effort and research, but on the other hand it produced the quality of a panic, hasty preparation, impatience of thought, a wasteful and sometimes quite futile immediacy. In 1909, for example, there was a vast clamour for 8 additional dreadnoughts. We want 8, and we won't wait. But no clamour at all about our national waste of inventive talent, our mean standard of intellectual attainment, our disingenuous criticism, and the consequent failure to distinguish men of the quality needed to carry on the modern type of war. Almost universally, we have the wrong men in our places of responsibility, and the right men in no place at all. Almost universally, we have poorly qualified, hesitating, and resentful subordinates, because our criticism is worthless and, so habitually as to be now almost unconsciously, dishonest. Germany is beating England in every matter upon which competition is possible, because she attended sedulously to her collective mind for 60 pregnant years, because in spite of tremendous defects she is still far more anxious for quality and achievement than we are. I remember saying that in my paper. From that, I remember, I went on to an image that had flashed into my mind. The British Empire, I said, is like some of those early vertebrated monsters, the Brontosaurus and the Atlantosaurus and such like. It sacrifices intellect to character. Its backbone, that is to say, especially in the visceral region, is bigger than its cranium. It's no accident that things are so. We've worked for backbone. We brag about backbone, and if the joints are ankylosed, so much the better. We're still but only half awake to our error. You can't change that suddenly. Turn it round and make it go backwards, interjected Thorns. It's trying to do that, I said, in places. And afterwards Krupp declared I had begotten a nightmare which haunted him for nights. He was trying desperately and belatedly to blow a brain as one blows soap bubbles on such a Mesozoic saurian as I had conjured up, while the clumsy monster's fate, all teeth and brains, crept nearer and nearer. I've grown, I think, since those days out of the urgency of that apprehension. I still think a European war, and conceivably a very humiliating war for England, may occur at no very distant date, but I do not think there is any such heroic quality in our governing class as will make that war catastrophic. The prevailing spirit in English life, it is one of the essential secrets of our imperial endurance, is one of underbred aggression in prosperity and diplomatic compromise in moments of danger. We bully haughtily where we can and assimilate where we must. It is not for nothing that our upper and middle-class youth is educated by teachers of the highest character, scholars and gentlemen, men who can pretend quite honestly that Darwinism hasn't upset the historical fall of man, that cricket is moral training, and that socialism is an outrage upon the teachings of Christ. A sort of dignified dexterity of evasion is the national reward. Germany, with a larger population, a vigorous and irreconcilable proletariat, a bolder intellectual training, a harsher spirit, can scarcely fail to drive us at last to a realization of intolerable strain. So we may never fight at all. The war of preparations that has been going on for 30 years may end like a sham fight at last in an umpire's decision. We shall proudly but very firmly take the second place. For my own part, since I love England as much as I detest her present lethargy of soul, I pray for a chastening war. I wouldn't mind her flag in the dirt if only her spirit would come out of it. So I was able to shake off that earlier fear of some final and irrevocable destruction truncating all my schemes. At the most, a European war would be a dramatic episode in the reconstruction I had in view. In India, too, I no longer foresee, as once I was inclined to see, disaster. The English rule in India is surely one of the most extraordinary accidents that has ever happened in history. We are there like a man who has fallen off a ladder onto the neck of an elephant and doesn't know what to do or how to get down. Until something happens, he remains. Our functions in India are absurd. We English do not own that country, do not even rule it. We make nothing happen. At the most, we prevent things happening. We suppress our own literature there. Most English people cannot even go to this land they possess. The authorities would prevent it. If Messrs. Perrone or Cook organized a cheap tour of Manchester operatives, it would be stopped. No one dare bring the average English voter face to face with the reality of India, or let the Indian native have a glimpse of the English voter. In my time, I have talked to English statesmen, Indian officials and ex-officials, viceroys, soldiers, everyone who might be supposed to know what India signifies, and I have prayed them all to tell me what they thought we were up to there. I am not writing without my book in these matters, and beyond a phrase or so about even-handed justice and look at our sedition trails, they told me nothing. Time after time I have heard of that apocryphal native ruler in the northwest who, when asked what would happen if we left India, replied that in a week his men would be in the saddle, and in 6 months not a rupee nor a virgin would be left in Lower Bengal. That is always given as our conclusive justification. But is it our business to preserve the rupees and virgins of Lower Bengal in a sort of magic inconclusiveness? Better plunder than paralysis, better fire and sword than futility. Our flag is spread over the peninsula without plans, without intentions, a vast preventative. The sum total of our policy is to arrest any discussion, any conferences that would enable the Indians to work out a tolerable scheme of the future for themselves. But that does not arrest the resentment of men held back from life. Consider what it must be for the educated Indian sitting at the feast of contemporary possibilities with his mouth gagged and his hands bound behind him. The spirit of insurrection breaks out in spite of espionage and seizures. Our conflict for inaction develops stupendous absurdities. The other day the British Empire was taking off and examining printed cotton stomach wraps for seditious emblems and inscriptions. In some manner, we shall have to come out of India. We have had our chance, and we have demonstrated nothing but the appalling dullness of our national imagination. We are not good enough to do anything with India. Codger and Flack and Gates and Dayton, Cladingbowl, in the club and the home churchman in the home, cant about character, worship of strenuous force and contempt of truth. For the sake of such men and things as these, we must abandon, in fact, if not in appearance, that empty domination. Had we great schools and a powerful teaching, could we boast great men? Had we the spirit of truth and creation in our lives, then indeed it might be different. But a race that bears a sceptre must carry gifts to justify it. It does not follow that we shall be driven catastrophically from India. That was my earlier mistake. We are not proud enough in our bones to be ruined by India as Spain was by her empire. We may be able to abandon India with an air of still remaining there. It is our new method. We train our future rulers in the public schools to have a very wholesome respect for strength, and as soon as power arises in India, in spite of us, be it a man or a culture or a native state, we shall be willing to deal with it. We may or may not have a war, but our governing class will be quick to learn when we are beaten. Then they will repeat our South African diplomacy and arrange for some settlement that will abandon the reality such as it is and preserve the semblance of power. The conqueror de facto will become the new loyal Britain, and the democracy at home will be invited to celebrate our recession triumphantly. I am no believer in the imminent dissolution of our empire. I am less and less inclined to see in either India or Germany the probability of an abrupt truncation of those slow intellectual and moral constructions which are the essentials of statecraft. 6. I sit writing in this little loggia to the sound of dripping water. This morning we had rain, and the roof of our little casa is still not dry. There are pools in the rocks under the sweet chestnuts, and the torrent that crosses the Salita is full and boastful. And I try to recall the order of my impressions during that watching dubious time before I went over to the Conservative Party. I was trying, chaotic task, to gauge the possibilities inherent in the quality of the British aristocracy. There comes a broad, spectacular effect of wide parks, diversified by woods and bracken valleys, and dappled with deer, of great smooth lawns shaded by ancient trees, of big facades of sunlit buildings dominating the countryside, of large, fine rooms full of handsome, easy-mannered people. As a sort of representative picture to set off against those other pictures of liberals and of socialists I have given, I recall one of those huge assemblies of the Duchess of Clynes inaugurated at Stamford House. The place itself is one of the vastest private houses in London, a huge clustering mass of white and gold saloons with polished floors and wonderful pictures, and staircases and galleries on a gargantuan scale. And there she sought to gather all that was most representative of English activities, and did, in fact, in those brilliant nocturnal crowds, get samples of nearly every section of our social and intellectual life, with a marked predominance upon the political and social side. I remember sitting in one of the recesses at the end of the big saloon with Mrs. Redmondson, one of those sharp-minded, beautiful, rich women one meets so often in London, who seem to have done nothing and to be capable of everything, and we watched the crowd. Uniforms and splendours were streaming in from a state ball, and exchanged information. I told her about the politicians and intellectuals, and she told me about the aristocrats, and we sharpened our wit on them and counted the percentage of beautiful people among the latter, and wondered if the general effect of tallness was or was not an illusion. They were, we agreed, for the most part, bigger than the average of people in London, and a handsome lot, even when they were not subtly individualized. They look so well nurtured, I said, well cared for. I like their quiet, well-trained movements, their pleasant consideration for each other. Kindly, good-tempered, and at bottom utterly selfish, she said. Like big, rather carefully trained, rather pampered children. What else can you expect from them? They are good-tempered, anyhow, I witnessed, and that's an achievement. I don't think I could ever be content under a bad-tempered sentimentalism, strenuous government. That's why I couldn't stand the Roosevelt regime in America. One's chief surprise when one comes across these big people for the first time is their admirable easiness and a real personal modesty. I confess I admire them. Oh, I like them. I wouldn't at all mind, I believe, giving over the country to this aristocracy, given something which they haven't got, or they'd be the finest sort of people in the world. That something? She inquired. I don't know. I've been puzzling my wits to know. They've done all sorts of things. That's Lord Rassleton, she interrupted, whose leg was broken, you remember? That spy on cop? It's healed very well. I like the gold lace and the white glove resting with a quiet, nice awkwardness on the sword. When I was a little boy, I wanted to wear clothes like that. And the stars. He's got the VC. Most of these people here have at any rate shown pluck, you know, brought something off. Not quite enough, she suggested. I think that's it, I said. Not quite enough, not quite hard enough, I added. She laughed and looked at me. You'd like to make us, she said. What? Hard. I don't think you'll go on if you don't get hard. We shan't be so pleasant if we do. Well, there my puzzled wits come in again. I don't see why an aristocracy shouldn't be rather hard-trained and yet kindly. I'm not convinced that the resources of education are exhausted. I want to better this because it already looks so good. How are we to do it? Asked Mrs. Redmondson. Oh, there you have me. I've been spending my time lately in trying to answer that. It makes me quarrel with— I held up my fingers and ticked the items off. The public schools, the private tutors, the army exams, the universities, the church, the general attitude of the country towards science and literature. We all do, said Mrs. Redmondson. We can't begin again at the beginning, she added. Couldn't one, I nodded at the Assembly in general, start a movement? There's the Confederates, she said, with a faint smile that masked a gleam of curiosity. You want, she said, to say to the aristocracy, be aristocrats, noblesse oblige. Do you remember what happened to the monarch who was told to be a king? Well, I said, I want an aristocracy. This, she said, smiling, is the pick of them. The backwoodsmen are off the stage. These are the brilliant ones, the smart and the blues. They cost a lot of money, you know. So far, Mrs. Redmondson, but the picture remained full of things not stated in our speech. They were, on the whole, handsome people, charitable-minded, happy and easy. They led spacious lives, and there was something free and fearless about their bearing that I liked extremely. The women, particularly, were wide-reading, fine-thinking. Mrs. Redmondson talked as fully and widely and boldly as a man, and with those flashes of intuition, those startling, sudden delicacies of perception few men display. I liked, too, the relations that held between women and men, their general tolerance, their antagonism to the harsh jealousies that are the essence of the middle-class order. After all, if one's aim resolved itself into the development of a type and culture of men, why shouldn't one begin at this end? It is very easy indeed to generalize about a class or human beings, but much harder to produce a sample. Was old Lady 400, for instance, fairly a sample? I remember her as a smiling, magnificent presence, a towering accumulation of figure and wonderful shimmering blue silk and black lace and black hair, and small fine features and chins and chins and chins, disposed in a big cane chair with wraps and cushions upon the great terrace of Champneys. Her eye was blue and hard, and her accent and intonation were exactly what you would expect from a rather commonplace dressmaker pretending to be aristocratic. I was, I am afraid, posing a little as the intelligent but respectful inquirer from below, investigating the great world, and she was certainly posing as my informant. She affected a cynical coarseness. She developed a theory on the governance of England, beautifully frank and simple. Give 'em all a peerage when they get 20,000 a year, she maintained. That's my remedy. In my new role of theoretical aristocrat, I felt a little abashed. 20,000, she repeated with conviction. It occurred to me that I was in the presence of the aristocratic theory currently working as distinguished from my as yet unformulated intentions. You'll get a lot of loafers and scamps among 'em, said Lady 400. You get loafers and scamps everywhere, but you'll get a lot of men who'll work hard to keep things together, and that's what we're all after, isn't it? It's not an ideal arrangement. Tell me anything better, said Lady 400. On the whole, and because she refused emphatically to believe in education, Lady 400 scored. We had been discussing Cossington's recent peerage, for Cossington, my old schoolfellow at City Merchants, and my victor in the affair of the magazine, had clambered to an amazing wealth up a piled heap of energetically pushed penny and halfpenny magazines and a group of daily newspapers. I had expected to find the great lady hostile to the newcomer, but she accepted him. She gloried in him. We're a peerage, she said, but none of us has ever had any nonsense about nobility. She turned and smiled down on me. We English, she said, are a practical people. We assimilate 'em. Then I suppose they don't give trouble. Then they don't give trouble. They learn to shoot. And all that, said Lady 400. Yes, and things go on. Sometimes better than others, but they go on somehow. It depends very much on the sort of butler who pokes 'em about. I suggested that it might be possible to get a secure 20,000 a year by at least detrimental methods, socially speaking. We must take the bad and the good of 'em, said Lady 400, courageously. Now, was she a sample? It happened she talked. What was there in the brains of the multitude of her first, second, third, fourth, and fifth cousins who didn't talk, who shone tall, and bearing themselves finely against a background of deft, attentive maids and valets on every spacious social scene? How did things look to them? 7. Side by side with Lady 400, it is curious to put Evesham with his tall, bent body, his little-featured, almost elvish face, his unequal mild brown eyes, his gentle manner, his sweet, amazing oratory. He led all these people wonderfully. He was always curious and interested about life, wary beneath a pleasing frankness, and I tormented my brain to get to the bottom of him. For a long time he was the most powerful man in England under the throne. He had the Lords in his hand and a great majority in the Commons, and the discontents and intrigues that are the concomitants of an overwhelming party advantage broke against him as waves break against a cliff. He foresaw so far in these matters that it seemed he scarcely troubled to foresee. He brought political art to the last triumph of naturalness. Always for me he has been the typical aristocrat, so typical and above the mere forms of aristocracy that he remained a commoner to the end of his days. I met him at the beginning of my career. He read some early papers of mine and asked to see me, and I conceived a flattered liking for him that strengthened to a very strong feeling indeed. He seemed to me to stand alone without an equal, the greatest man in British political life. Some men one sees through and understands, some one cannot see into or round because they are of opaque clay, but about Evesham I had a sense of things hidden as it were by depth and mists, because he was so big and atmospheric a personality. No other contemporary has had that effect upon me. I sat beside him at dinners, stayed in houses with him. He was in the big house party at Champneys, talked to him, sounded him, watching him as I sat beside him. I could talk to him with extraordinary freedom and a rare sense of being understood. Other men have to be treated in a special manner, approached through their own mental dialect, flattered by a minute regard for what they have said and done. Evesham was as widely and charitably receptive as any man I have ever met. The common politician beside him seemed like rows of stuffy little rooms looking out upon the sea. And what was he up to? What did he think we were doing with mankind? That I thought worth knowing. I remember his talking on one occasion at the Hartsteins, at a dinner so tremendously floriferous and equipped that we were almost forced into duologues about the possible common constructive purpose in politics. "I feel so much," he said, "that the best people in every party converge. We don't differ at Westminster as they do in the country towns. There's a sort of extending common policy that goes on under every government, because on the whole it's the right thing to do and people know it. Things that used to be matters of opinion become matters of science and cease to be party questions." He instanced education. "Apart," said I, "from the religious question." "Apart from the religious question." He dropped that aspect with an easy grace and went on with his general theme that political conflict was the outcome of uncertainty. Directly you get a thing established so that people can say, "Now this is right," with the same conviction that people can say water is a combination of oxygen and hydrogen, there's no more to be said. The thing has to be done. And to put this against the effect of Evesham, broad and humanely tolerant, posing as the minister of a steadily developing constructive conviction, there are other memories. Have I not seen him in the House, persistent, persuasive, indefatigable, and by all my standards wickedly perverse, leaning over the table with those insistent movements of his hand upon it, or swaying forward with a grip upon his coat lapel, fighting with a diabolical skill to preserve what are in effect religious tests he must have known would outrage and humiliate and injure the consciences of a quarter, and that perhaps the best quarter, of the youngsters who come to the work of elementary education. In playing for points in the game of party advantage, Evesham displayed at times a quite wicked unscrupulousness in the use of his subtle mind. I would sit on the Liberal benches and watch him and listen to his urbane voice, fascinated by him. Did he really care? Did anything matter to him? And if it really mattered nothing, why did he trouble to serve the narrowness and passion of his side? Or did he see far beyond my scope, so that this petty iniquity was justified by greater, remoter ends of which I had no intimation? They accused him of nepotism. His friends and family were certainly well cared for. In private life he was full of an affectionate intimacy. He pleased by being charmed and pleased. One might think at times there was no more of him than a clever man happily circumstanced and finding an interest and occupation in politics. And then came a glimpse of thought, of imagination, like the sight of a soaring eagle through a staircase skylight. Oh, beyond question he was great. No other contemporary politician had his quality. In no man have I perceived so sympathetically the great contrast between warm personal things and the white dream of statecraft. Except that he had, it seemed, no hot passions, but only interests and fine affections and indolences, he paralleled the conflict of my life. He saw and thought widely and deeply, but at times it seemed to me his greatness stood over and behind the reality of his life, like some splendid servant thinking his own thoughts, who waits behind a lesser master's chair. 8. Of course, when Evesham talked of this ideal of the organized state becoming so finely true to practicability and so clearly stated as to have the compelling conviction of physical science, he spoke quite after my heart. Had he really embodied the attempt to realize that, I could have done no more than follow him blindly. But neither he nor I embodied that, and there lies the gist of my story. And when it came to a study of others among the leading Tories and Imperialists, the doubt increased, until with some at last it was possible to question whether they had any imaginative conception of constructive statecraft at all, whether they didn't opaquely accept the world for what it was, and set themselves single-mindedly to make a place for themselves and cut a figure in it. There were some very fine personalities among them. There were the great peers who had administered Egypt, India, South Africa, Framboya, Cromer, Kitchener, Curzon, Milner, Gain, for example. So far as that easier task of holding sword and scales had gone, they had shown the finest qualities, but they had returned to the perplexing and exacting problem of the home country, a little glorious, a little too simply bold. They wanted to arm and they wanted to educate, but the habit of immediate necessity made them far more eager to arm than to educate, and their experience of heterogeneous controls made them overrate the need for obedience in a homogeneous country. They didn't understand raw men, ill-trained men, uncertain minds, and intelligent women, and these are the things that matter in England. There were also the great business adventurers, from Cranber to Cossington, who was now Lord Paddock-Hurst. My mind remained unsettled, and went up and down the scale between a belief in their far-sighted purpose and the perception of crude vanities, coarse ambitions, vulgar competitiveness, and a mere habitual persistence in the pursuit of gain. For a time I saw a good deal of Cossington. I wish I had kept a diary of his talk and gestures, to mark how he could vary from day to day between a poseur, a smart tradesman, and a very bold and wide-thinking political schemer. He had a vanity of sweeping actions, motor-car pounces, Napoleonic rushes that led to violent and effectual changes in the policy of his papers, and a haunting pursuit by parallel columns in the liberal press that never abashed him in the slightest degree. By an accident I plumbed the folly in him, but I feel I never plumbed his wisdom. I remember him one day after a lunch at the Barhams, saying suddenly, out of profound meditation over the end of a cigar, one of those sentences that seem to light the whole interior being of a man. "Some day," he said softly, rather to himself than to me, and apropos of nothing, "some day I will raise the country." "Why not?" I said after a pause, and leant across him for the little silver spirit lamp to light my cigarette. Then the Tories had for another section the ancient creations, and again there were the financial peers, men accustomed to reserve, and their big lawyers, accustomed to, qualified statement. And below the giant personalities of the party were the young bloods, young, adventurous men of the type of Lord Tarville, who had seen service in South Africa, who had travelled and hunted, explorers, keen motorists, interested in aviation, active in army organization. Good, brown-faced stuff they were, but impervious to ideas outside the range of their activities, more ignorant of science than their chauffeurs, and of the quality of English people than Welt politicians. Contemptuous of school and university by reason of the Gateses and Flacks and Codgers who had come their way, witty, light-hearted, patriotic at the Kipling level, with a certain aptitude for bullying. They varied in insensible gradations between the noble sportsmen on the one hand, and men like Gain and the Tories of our Pentagram Club on the other. You perceive how a man might exercise his mind in the attempt to strike an average of public serviceability in this miscellany, and mixed up sometimes in the same man, was the pure reactionary whose predominant idea was that the village schools should confine themselves to teaching the catechism, hat-touching and curtsying, and be given a holiday whenever beaters were in request. I find now in my mind, as a sort of counterpoise to Evesham, the figure of old Lord Wardingham, asleep in the largest armchair in the library at Stamford Court after lunch. One foot rested on one of those things, I think they are called gout stools. He had been playing golf all the morning, had wearied a weak instep. At lunch he had sat at my table and talked in the overbearing manner permitted to irascible, important men whose insteps are painful. Among other things, he had flouted the idea that women would ever understand statecraft or be more than a nuisance in politics. Denied flatly that Hindus were capable of anything whatever except excesses in population. Regretted he could not censor picture galleries and circulating libraries, and declared that dissenters were people who pretended to take theology seriously with the express purpose of upsetting the entirely satisfactory compromise of the established church. "No sensible people with anything to gain or lose argue about religion," he said. "They mean mischief." Having delivered his soul upon these points, and silenced the little conversation to the left of him from which they had arisen, he became, after an appreciative encounter with a sanguinary woodcock, more amiable, responded to some respectful initiatives of Krupp's, and related a number of classical anecdotes of those blighting snubs, vindictive retorts and scandalous miscarriages of justice that are so dear to the forensic mind. Now he reposed. He was breathing heavily with his mouth a little open and his head on one side. One whisker was turned back against the comfortable padding. His plump, strong hands gripped the arms of his chair, and his frown was a little assuaged. How tremendously fed up he looked. Honours, wealth, influence, respect, he had them all. How scornful and hard it had made his unguarded expression. I note without comment that it didn't even occur to me then to wake him up and ask him what he was up to with mankind. 9. One countervailing influence to my drift to Toryism in those days was Margaret's quite religious faith in the Liberals. I realized that slowly and with a mild astonishment. It set me, indeed, even then questioning my own change of opinion. We came at last, incidentally, as our way was, to an exchange of views. It was as nearly a quarrel as we had before I came over to the Conservative side. It was at Champneys, and I think during the same visit that witnessed my exploration of Lady 400. It arose indirectly, I think, out of some comments of mine upon our fellow guests, but it is one of those memories of which the scene and quality remain more vivid than the things said, a memory without any very definite beginning or end. It was afternoon, in the pause between tea and the dressing bell, and we were in Margaret's big silver-adorned, chintz-bright room, looking out on the trim Italian garden. Yes, the beginning of it has escaped me altogether, but I remember it as an odd, exceptional little wrangle. At first we seemed to have split upon the moral quality of the aristocracy, and I had an odd sense that in some way too feminine for me to understand, our hostess had aggrieved her. She said, I know, that Champneys distressed her, made her eager for work and reality again. But aren't these people real? They're so superficial, so extravagant. I said I was not shocked by their unreality. They seemed the least affected people I had ever met. And are they really so extravagant? I asked, and put it to her that her dresses cost quite as much as any other woman's in the house. It's not only their dresses, Margaret parried. It's the scale and spirit of things. I questioned that. They're cynical, said Margaret, staring before her out of the window. I challenged her, and she quoted the Brabants, about whom there had been an ancient scandal. She heard of it from Altiora, and it was also Altiora who had given her a horror of Lord Carnaby, who was also with us. You know his reputation, said Margaret. That Normandy girl, everyone knows about it. I shiver when I look at him. He seems, like something not of our civilization. He will come and say little things to me. Offensive things? No, politenesses and things. Of course, his manners are quite right. That only makes it worse, I think. It shows he might have helped all that happened. I do all I can to make him see I don't like him, but none of the others make the slightest objection to him. Perhaps these people imagine something might be said for him. That's just it, said Margaret. Charity, I suggested. I don't like that sort of toleration. I was oddly annoyed. Like eating with publicans and sinners, I said. No. But scandals and the contempt for rigid standards their condonation displayed weren't more than the sharp edge of the trouble. It's their whole position, their selfish predominance, their class conspiracy against the mass of people, said Margaret. When I sit at dinner in that splendid room, with its glitter and white reflections and candlelight, and its flowers and its wonderful service and its candelabra of solid gold, I seem to feel the slums and the mines and the overcrowded cottages stuffed away under the table. I reminded Margaret that she was not altogether innocent of unearned increment. But aren't we doing our best to give it back? She said. I was moved to question her. Do you really think, I asked, that the Tories and peers and rich people are to blame for social injustice as we have it today? Do you really see politics as a struggle of light on the Liberal side against darkness on the Tory? They must know, said Margaret. I found myself questioning that. I see now that to Margaret it must have seemed the perversest carping against manifest things, but at the time I was concentrated simply upon the elucidation of her view and my own. I wanted to get at her conception in the sharpest, hardest lines that were possible. It was perfectly clear that she saw Toryism as the diabolical element in affairs. The thing showed in its hopeless untruth all the clearer for the fine, clean emotion with which she gave it out to me. My sleeping peer in the library at Stamford Court and Evesham talking luminously behind the Hartstein flowers embodied the devil, and my replete citizen sucking at his cigar in the National Liberal Club, Willie Crampton, discussing the care and management of the stomach over a specially hygienic lemonade, and Dr. Tumpany, in his aggressive frock coat, pegging out a sort of copyright in socialism, were the centre and wings of the angelic side. It was nonsense, but how was I to put the truth to her? "I don't see things at all as you do," I said. "I don't see things in the same way." "Think of the poor," said Margaret, going off at a tangent. "Think of everyone," I said. "We Liberals have done more mischief through well-intentioned benevolence than all the selfishness in the world could have done. We built up the liquor interest." "We?" cried Margaret. "How can you say that? It's against us." "Naturally, but we made it a monopoly in our clumsy efforts to prevent people drinking what they liked, because it interfered with industrial regularity." "Oh," cried Margaret, stung, and I could see she thought I was talking mere wickedness. "That's it," I said. "But would you have people drink whatever they pleased?" "Certainly. What right have I to dictate to other men and women?" "But think of the children." "Ah, there you have the folly of modern liberalism. Its half-cunning, half-silly way of getting at everything in a roundabout fashion. If neglecting children is an offence, and it is an offence, then deal with it as such, but don't go badgering and restricting people who sell something that may possibly, in some cases, lead to a neglect of children. If drunkenness is an offence, punish it, but don't punish a man for selling honest drink that perhaps, after all, won't make anyone drunk at all. Don't intensify the viciousness of the public house by assuming the place isn't fit for women and children. That's either spite or folly. Make the public house fit for women and children. Make it a real public house. If we Liberals go on as we are going, we shall presently want to stop the sale of ink and paper because those things tempt men to forgery. We do already threaten the privacy of the post because of betting touts' letters. The drift of all that kind of thing is narrow, unimaginative, mischievous, stupid." I stopped short and walked to the window and surveyed a pretty fountain, a facsimile of one in Verona, amidst trim-cut borderings of yew. Beyond, and seen between the stems of ilex trees, was a great blaze of yellow flowers. "But prevention," I heard Margaret behind me, "is the essence of our work." I turned. "There's no prevention but education. There's no antiseptics in life but love and fine thinking. Make people fine, make fine people. Don't be afraid. These Tory leaders are better people individually than the average. Why cast them for the villains of the piece? The real villain in the piece is the whole human drama, is the muddle-headedness, and it matters very little if it's virtuous-minded or wicked. I want to get at muddle-headedness. If I could do that, I could let all that you call wickedness in the world run about and do what it jolly well pleased. It would matter about as much as a slightly neglected dog in an otherwise well-managed home." My thoughts had run away with me. "I can't understand you," said Margaret, in the profoundest distress. "I can't understand how it is you are coming to see things like this." 10. The moods of a thinking man in politics are curiously evasive and difficult to describe. Neither the public nor the historian will permit the statesman moods. He has from the first to assume he has an aim, a definite aim, and to pretend to an absolute consistency with that. Those subtle questionings about the very fundamentals of life, which plague us all so relentlessly nowadays, are supposed to be silenced. He lifts his chin and pursues his aim explicitly in the sight of all men. Those who have no real political experience can scarcely imagine the immense mental and moral strain there is between one's everyday acts and utterances on the one hand, and the thinking out process on the other. It is perplexingly difficult to keep in your mind, fixed and firm, a scheme essentially complex, to keep balancing a swaying possibility, while at the same time, under jealous, hostile, and stupid observation, you tread your part in the platitudinous, quarrelsome, ill-presented march of affairs. The most impossible of all autobiographies is an intellectual autobiography. I have thrown together in the crudest way the elements of the problem I struggled with, but I can give no record of the subtle details. I can tell nothing of the long vacillations between protean values, the talks and retalks, the meditations, the bleak lucidities of sleepless nights. And yet these things I have struggled with must be thought out. And to begin with, they must be thought out in this muddled, experimenting way. To go into a study to think about statecraft is to turn your back on the realities you are constantly needing to feel and test and sound if your thinking is to remain vital. To choose an aim and pursue it in despite of all subsequent questionings is to bury the talent of your mind. It is no use dealing with the intricate as though it were simple, to leap haphazard at the first course of action that presents itself. The whole world of politicians is far too like a man who snatches a poker to a fading watch. It is easy to say he wants to get something done, but the only sane thing to do for the moment is to put aside that poker and take thought and get a better implement. One of the results of these fundamental preoccupations of mine was a curious irritability towards Margaret that I found difficult to conceal. It was one of the incidental cruelties of our position that this should happen. I was in such doubt myself that I had no power to phrase things for her in a form she could use. Hitherto I had stage-managed our serious conversations. Now I was too much in earnest and too uncertain to go on doing this. I avoided talk with her. Her serene, sustained confidence in vague formulae and sentimental aspirations exasperated me. Her want of sympathetic apprehension made my few efforts to indicate my changing attitudes distressing and futile. It wasn't that I was always thinking right, and that she was always saying wrong. It was that I was struggling to get hold of a difficult thing that was, at any rate, half true. I could not gauge how true, and that Margaret's habitual phrasing ignored these elusive elements of truth, and without premeditation fitted into the weaknesses of my new intimations, as though they had nothing but weaknesses. It was, for example, obvious that these big people, who were the backbone of imperialism and conservatism, were temperamentally lax, much more indolent, much more sensuous than our deliberately virtuous young liberals. I didn't want to be reminded of that, just when I was in full effort to realize the finer elements in their composition. Margaret classed them and disposed of them. It was our incurable differences in habits and gestures of thought coming between us again. The desert of misunderstanding widened. I was forced back upon myself and my own secret counsels. For a time I went my way alone, an unmixed evil for both of us. Except for that Pentagram evening, a series of talks with Isabel Rivers, who was now becoming more and more important in my intellectual life, and the arguments I maintained with Krupp, I never really opened my mind at all during that period of indecisions, slow abandonments, and slow acquisitions. Chapter the 3rd. Secession. 1. At last, out of a vast accumulation of impressions, decision distilled quite suddenly. I succumbed to Evesham and that dream of the right thing triumphant through expression. I determined I would go over to the Conservatives and use my every gift and power on the side of such forces on that side as made for educational reorganization, scientific research, literature, criticism, and intellectual development. That was in 1909. I judged the Tories were driving straight at a conflict with the country, and I thought them bound to incur an electoral defeat. I underestimated their strength in the counties. There would follow, I calculated, a period of profound reconstruction in method and policy alike. I was entirely at one with Krupp in perceiving in this an immense opportunity for the things we desired. An aristocracy quickened by conflict and on the defensive, and full of the idea of justification by reconstruction, might prove altogether more apt for thought and high professions than Mrs. Redmondson's spoilt children. Behind the now inevitable struggle for a reform of the House of Lords, there would be great heart-searchings and educational endeavour. On that we reckoned. At last we talked it out to the practical pitch, and Krupp and Shoesmith and I and Gain made our definite agreement together. I emerged from enormous silences upon Margaret one evening. She was just back from the display of some new musicians at the Hartsteins. I remember she wore a dress of golden satin, very rich-looking and splendid. About her slender neck there was a rope of gold-set amber beads. Her hair caught up and echoed and returned these golden notes. I, too, was in evening dress, but where I had been escapes me. Some forgotten dinner, I suppose. I went into her room. I remember I didn't speak for some moments. I went across to the window and pulled the blind aside and looked out upon the railed garden of the square, with its shrubs and shadowed turf gleaming pallidly and irregularly in the light of the big electric standard in the corner. "Margaret," I said, "I think I shall break with the party." She made no answer. I turned presently, a movement of inquiry. "I was afraid you meant to do that," she said. "I'm out of touch," I explained. "Altogether." "Oh, I know." "It places me in a difficult position," I said. Margaret stood at her dressing-table, looking steadfastly at herself in the glass, and with her fingers playing with a litter of stoppered bottles of tinted glass. "I was afraid it was coming to this," she said. "In a way," I said. "We've been allies. I owe my seat to you. I couldn't have gone into Parliament." "I don't want considerations like that to affect us," she interrupted. There was a pause. She sat down in a chair by her dressing-table, lifted an ivory hand-glass and put it down again. "I wish," she said, with something like a sob in her voice, "it were possible that you shouldn't do this." She stopped abruptly, and I did not look at her, because I could feel the effort she was making to control herself. "I thought," she began again, "when you came into Parliament—" There was another silence. "It's all gone so differently," she said. "Everything has gone so differently." I had a sudden memory of her, shining triumphant after the King Hampstead election, and for the first time I realized just how perplexing and disappointing my subsequent career must have been to her. "I'm not doing this without consideration," I said. "I know," she said in a voice of despair. "I've seen it coming, but I still don't understand it. I don't understand how you can go over." "My ideas have changed and developed," I said. I walked across to her bearskin hearthrug and stood by the mantel. "To think that you," she said, "you might have been leader." She could not finish it. "All the forces of reaction," she threw out. "I don't think they are the forces of reaction," I said. "I think I can find work to do, better work on that side." "Against us?" she said. "As if progress wasn't hard enough, as if it didn't call upon every able man." "I don't think liberalism has a monopoly of progress." She didn't answer that. She sat quite still, looking in front of her. "Why have you gone over?" she asked abruptly, as though I had said nothing. There came a silence that I was impelled to end. I began a stiff dissertation from the hearthrug. "I'm going over because I think I may join in an intellectual renaissance of the Conservative side. I think that in the coming struggle there will be a partial and altogether confused and demoralizing victory for democracy. That will stir the classes which now dominate the Conservative Party into an energetic revival. They will set out to win back and win back. Even if my estimate of contemporary forces is wrong and they win, they will still be forced to reconstruct their outlook. A war abroad will supply the chastening if home politics fail. The effort at renaissance is bound to come by either alternative. I believe I can do more in relation to that effort than in any other connection in the world of politics at the present time. That's my case, Margaret. She certainly did not grasp what I said. And so you will throw aside all the beginnings, all the beliefs and pledges? Again her sentence remained incomplete. I doubt if even once you have gone over they will welcome you. But that hardly matters. I made an effort to resume my speech. I came into Parliament, Margaret, I said, a little prematurely. Still, I suppose it was only by coming into Parliament that I could see things as I do now in terms of personality and imaginative range. I stopped. Her stiff, unhappy, unlistening silence broke up my disquisition. After all, I remarked, most of this has been implicit in my writings. She made no sign of admission. What are you going to do? She asked. Keep my seat for a time and make the reasons of my breach clear? Then either I must resign or probably this new budget will lead to a general election. It's evidently meant to strain the Lords and provoke a quarrel. You might, I think, have stayed to fight for the budget. I'm not, I said, so keen against the Lords. On that we halted. But what are you going to do? She asked. I shall make my quarrel over some points in the budget. I can't quite tell you yet where my chance will come. Then I shall either resign my seat, or if things drift to dissolution, I shall stand again. It's political suicide? Not altogether. I can't imagine you out of Parliament again. It's just like undoing all we've done. What will you do? Right. Make a new, more definite place for myself. You know, of course, there's already a sort of group about Krupp and Gain. Margaret seemed lost for a time in painful thought. For me, she said at last, our political work has been a religion. It has been more than a religion. I heard in silence. I had no form of protest available against the implications of that. And then I find you turning against all we aim to do, talking of going over, almost lightly, to those others. She was white-lipped as she spoke. In the most curious way, she had captured the moral values of the situation. I found myself protesting ineffectually against her fixed conviction. It's because I think my duty lies in this change that I make it, I said. I don't see how you can say that, she replied quietly. There was another pause between us. Oh, she said, and clenched her hand upon the table, that it should have come to this. She was extraordinarily dignified and extraordinarily absurd. She was hurt and thwarted beyond measure. She had no place in her ideas, I thought, for me. I could see how it appeared to her, but I could not make her see anything of the intricate process that had brought me to this divergence. The opposition of our intellectual temperaments was like a gag in my mouth. What was there for me to say? A flash of intuition told me that behind her white dignity was a passionate disappointment, a shattering of dreams that needed before everything else the relief of weeping. I've told you, I said awkwardly, as soon as I could. There was another long silence. So that is how we stand, I said, with an air of having things defined. I walked slowly to the door. She had risen and stood now, staring in front of her. Good night, I said, making no movement towards our habitual kiss. Good night, she answered in a tragic note. I closed the door softly. I remained for a moment or so on the big landing, hesitating between my bedroom and my study. As I did so, I heard the soft rustle of her movement and the click of the key in her bedroom door. Then everything was still. She hid her tears from me. Something gripped my heart at the thought. Damnation, I said, wincing. Why the devil can't people at least think in the same manner? 2. And that insufficient colloquy was the beginning of a prolonged estrangement between us. It was characteristic of our relations that we never reopened the discussion. The thing had been in the air for some time. We had recognized it now. The widening breach between us was confessed. My own feelings were curiously divided. It is remarkable that my very real affection for Margaret only became evident to me with this quarrel. The changes of the heart are very subtle changes. I am quite unaware how or when my early romantic love for her purity and beauty and high-principled devotion evaporated from my life. But I do know that quite early in my parliamentary days there had come a vague, unconfessed resentment at the tie that seemed to hold me in servitude to her standards of private living and public act. I felt I was caught, and none the less so because it had been my own act to rivet on my shackles. So long as I still held myself bound to her, that resentment grew. Now, since I had broken my bonds and taken my line, it withered again, and I could think of Margaret with a returning kindliness. But I still felt embarrassment with her. I felt myself dependent upon her for house-room and food and social support, as it were under false pretences. I would have liked to have separated our financial affairs altogether, but I knew that to raise the issue would have seemed a last brutal indelicacy. So I tried almost furtively to keep my personal expenditure within the scope of the private income I made by writing, and we went out together in her motor brougham, dined and made appearances, met politely at breakfast, parted at night with a kiss upon her cheek. The locking of her door upon me, which at that time I quite understood, which I understand now, became for a time in my mind, through some obscure process of the soul, an offence. I never crossed the landing to her room again. In all this matter, and indeed in all my relations with Margaret, I perceive now I behaved badly and foolishly. My manifest blunder is that I, who was several years older than she, much subtler and in many ways wiser, never in any measure sought to guide and control her. After our marriage, I treated her always as an equal, and let her go her way, held her responsible for all the weak and ineffective and unfortunate things she said and did to me. She wasn't clever enough to justify that. It wasn't fair to expect her to sympathize, anticipate, and understand. I ought to have taken care of her, roped her to me when it came to crossing the difficult places. If I had loved her more, and wiselier, and more tenderly, if there had not been the consciousness of my financial dependence on her always stiffening my pride, I think she would have moved with me from the outset, and left the Liberals with me. But she did not get any inkling of the ends I sought in my change of sides. It must have seemed to her inexplicable perversity. She had, I knew, for surely I knew it then, an immense capacity for loyalty and devotion. There she was with these treasures untouched, neglected and perplexed. A woman who loves wants to give. It is the duty and business of the man she has married for love to help her to help and give. But I was stupid. My eyes had never been opened. I was stiff with her and difficult to her, because even on my wedding morning there had been, deep down in my soul, voiceless though present, something weakly protesting, a faint perception of wrongdoing, the infinitesimally small, slow multiplying germs of shame. 3. I made my breach with the party on the budget. In many ways I was disposed to regard the 1909 budget as a fine piece of statecraft. Its production was certainly a very unexpected display of vigour on the Liberal side. But, on the whole, this movement towards collectivist organisation on the part of the Liberals rather strengthened than weakened my resolve to cross the floor of the House. It made it more necessary, I thought, to leaven the purely obstructive and reactionary elements that were at once manifest in the opposition. I assailed the land taxation proposals in one main speech and a series of minor speeches in committee. The line of attack I chose was that land was a great public service that needed to be controlled on broad and far-sighted lines. I had no objection to its nationalization, but I did object most strenuously to the idea of leaving it in private hands and attempting to produce beneficial social results through the pressure of taxation upon the land-owning class. That might break it up in an utterly disastrous way. The drift of the government proposals was all in the direction of sweating the landowner to get immediate values from his property, and such a course of action was bound to give us an irritated and vindictive landowning class. The class upon which we had hitherto relied, not unjustifiably, for certain broad patriotic services and an influence upon our collective judgments that no other class seemed prepared to exercise. Abolish landlordism if you will, I said, buy it out, but do not drive it to a defensive fight, and leave it still sufficiently strong and wealthy to become a malcontent element in your state. You have taxed and controlled the brewer and the publican until the outraged liquor interest has become a national danger. You now propose to do the same thing on a larger scale. You turn a class which has many fine and truly aristocratic traditions towards revolt, and there is nothing in these or any other of your proposals that shows any sense of the need for leadership to replace these traditional leaders that you are ousting. This was the substance of my case, and I hammered at it not only in the House but in the press. The King Hampstead division remained for some time insensitive to my defection. Then it woke up suddenly, and began in the columns of the King Hampstead Guardian an indignant, confused outcry. I was treated to an open letter signed Junius Secundus, and I replied in provocative terms. There were 2 thinly attended public meetings at different ends of the constituency, and then I had a correspondence with my old friend Parville, the photographer, which ended in my seeing a deputation. My impression is that it consisted of about 18 or 20 people. They had to come upstairs to me, and they were manifestly full of indignation and a little short of breath. There was Parville himself, J.P., dressed wholly in black, I think to mark his sense of the occasion, and curiously suggestive in his respect for my character and his concern for the honourableness of the King Hampstead Guardian editor, of Mark Antony at the funeral of Caesar. There was Mrs. Bulger, also in mourning. She had never abandoned the widow's streamers since the death of her husband 10 years ago, and her loyalty to liberalism of the severest type was part, as it were, of her weeds. There was a nephew of Sir Roderick Newton, a bright young Hebrew of the graver type, and a couple of dissenting ministers in high collars and hats that stopped halfway between the bowler of this world and the shovel hat of heaven. There was also a young solicitor from Lurkey, done in the horsey style, and there was a very little nervous man with a high brow and a face contracting below as though the jawbones and teeth had been taken out and the features compressed. The rest of the deputation, which included 2 other public-spirited ladies and several ministers of religion, might have been raked out of any omnibus going Strandward during the May meetings. They thrust Parville forward as spokesman and manifested a strong disposition to say, "Hear, hear," to his more strenuous protests, provided my eye wasn't upon them at the time. I regarded this appealing deputation as Parville's apologetic but quite definite utterances drew to an end. I had a moment of vision. Behind them I saw the wonderful array of skeleton forces that stand for public opinion, that are as much public opinion as exists indeed at the present time. The whole process of politics, which bulks so solidly in history, seemed for that clairvoyant instant but a froth of petty motives above abysms of indifference. Someone had finished. I perceived I had to speak. "Very well," I said. "I won't keep you long in replying. I'll resign if there isn't a dissolution before next February, and if there is, I shan't stand again. You don't want the bother and expense of a by-election, approving murmurs, if it can be avoided. But I may tell you plainly now that I don't think it will be necessary for me to resign, and the sooner you find my successor, the better for the party. The Lords are in a corner. They've got to fight now or never, and I think they will throw out the budget. Then they will go on fighting. It is a fight that will last for years. They have a sort of social discipline, and you haven't. You Liberals will find yourselves with a country behind you, vaguely indignant perhaps, but totally unprepared with any ideas whatever in the matter, face to face with the problem of bringing the British Constitution up to date. Anything may happen, provided only that it is sufficiently absurd. If the King backs the Lords, and I don't see why he shouldn't, you have no Republican movement whatever to fall back upon. You lost it during the era of good taste. The country, I say, is destitute of ideas, and you have no ideas to give it. I don't see what you will do. For my own part, I mean to spend a year or so between a window and my writing desk. I paused. I think, gentlemen, began Parville, that we hear all this with very great regret. IV. My estrangement from Margaret stands in my memory now as something that played itself out within the four walls of our house in Radnor Square, which was, indeed, confined to those limits. I went to and fro between my house and the House of Commons, and the dining rooms and clubs and offices in which we were preparing our new developments, in a state of aggressive and energetic dissociation, in the nascent state, as a chemist would say. I was free now, and greedy for fresh combination. I had a tremendous sense of released energies. I had got back to the sort of thing I could do, and to the work that had been shaping itself for so long in my imagination. Our purpose now was plain, bold, and extraordinarily congenial. We meant no less than to organize a new movement in English thought and life, to resuscitate a public opinion and prepare the ground for a revised and renovated ruling culture. For a time I seemed quite wonderfully able to do whatever I wanted to do. Shoesmith responded to my first advances. We decided to create a weekly paper as our nucleus, and Krupp and I set to work forthwith to collect a group of writers and speakers, including Esmere, Britton, Lord Gane, Neil, and one or two younger men, which should constitute a more or less definite editorial council about me, and meet at a weekly lunch on Tuesday to sustain our general co-operations. We marked our claim upon Toryism, even in the colour of our wrapper, and spoke of ourselves collectively as the Blue Weeklies. But our lunches were open to all sorts of guests, and our deliberations were never of a character to control me effectively in my editorial decisions. My only influential counsellor at first was old Britton, who became my sub-editor. It was curious how we two had picked up our ancient intimacy again, and resumed the easy give and take of our speculative, dreaming schoolboy days. For a time my life centred altogether upon this journalistic work. Britton was an experienced journalist, and I had most of the necessary instincts for the business. We meant to make the paper right and good down to the smallest detail, and to set ourselves at this with extraordinary zeal. It wasn't our intention to show our political motives too markedly at first, and through all the dust-storm and tumult and stress of the political struggle of 1910, we made a little intellectual oasis of good art criticism and good writing. It was the firm belief of nearly all of us that the Lords were destined to be beaten badly in 1910, and our game was the longer game of reconstruction that would begin when the shouting and tumult of that immediate conflict were over. Meanwhile, we had to get into touch with just as many good minds as possible. As we felt our feet, I developed slowly and carefully a broadly conceived and consistent political attitude. As I will explain later, we were feminist from the outset, though that caused Shoesmith and Gane great searching of heart, We developed Esmia's House of Lords reform scheme into a general cult of the aristocratic virtues, and we did much to humanize and liberalize the narrow excellencies of that break-up of the poor law agitation which had been organized originally by Beatrice and Sidney Webb. In addition, without any very definite explanation to anyone but Esmia and Isabel Rivers, and as if it was quite a small matter, I set myself to secure a uniform philosophical quality in our columns. That, indeed, was the peculiar virtue and characteristic of the Blue Weekly. I was now very definitely convinced that much of the confusion and futility of contemporary thought was due to the general need of metaphysical training. The great mass of people, and not simply common people, but people active and influential in intellectual things, are still quite untrained in the methods of thought and absolutely innocent of any criticism of method. It is scarcely a caricature to call their thinking a crazy patchwork, discontinuous and chaotic. They arrive at conclusions by a kind of accident, and do not suspect any other way may be found to their attainment. A stage above this general condition stands that minority of people who have at the same time or other discovered general terms and a certain use for generalizations. They are, to fall back on the ancient technicality, realists of a crude sort. When I say realist, of course, I mean realist as opposed to nominalist, and not realist in the almost diametrically different sense of opposition to idealist. Such are the Baileys, such, to take their great prototype, was Herbert Spencer, who couldn't read Kant. Such are whole regiments of prominent and entirely self-satisfied contemporaries. They go through queer little processes of definition and generalization and deduction with the completest belief in the vitality of the intellectual instrument they are using. They are realists, cocksurists in matter of fact, sentimentalists in behavior. The Baileys, having got to this glorious stage in mental development, it is glorious because it has no doubts, were always talking about training experts to apply the same simple process to all the affairs of mankind. Well, realism isn't the last word of human wisdom. Modest-minded people, doubtful people, subtle people, and the like, the kind of people William James writes of as tough-minded, go on beyond this methodical happiness, and are forever after critical of premises and terms. They are truer and less confident. They have reached skepticism and the artistic method. They have emerged into the new nominalism. Both Isabel and I believe firmly that these differences of intellectual method matter profoundly in the affairs of mankind, that the collective mind of this intricate, complex modern state can only function properly upon neo-nominalist lines. This has always been her side of our mental cooperation rather than mine. Her mind has the light movement that goes so often with natural mental power. She has a wonderful art in illustration, and, as the reader probably knows already, she writes of metaphysical matters with a rare charm and vividness. So far there has been no collection of her papers published, but they are to be found not only in the Blue Weekly columns, but scattered about the monthlies. Many people must be familiar with her style. It was an intention we did much to realize before our private downfall, that we would use the Blue Weekly to maintain a stream of suggestion against crude thinking, and at last, scarcely a week passed, but some popular distinction, some large imposing generalization, was touched to flaccidity by her pen or mine. I was at great pains to give my philosophical, political, and social matter the best literary and critical backing we could get in London. I hunted sedulously for good descriptive writing and good criticism. I was indefatigable in my readiness to hear and consider, if not to accept advice. I watched every corner of the paper, and had a dozen men alert to get me special matter of the sort that draws in the unattached reader. The chief danger on the literary side of a weekly is that it should fall into the hands of some particular school, and this I watched for closely. It seems impossible to get vividness of apprehension and breadth of view together in the same critic. So it falls to the wise editor to secure the first and impose the second. Directly I detected the shrill partisan note in our criticism, the attempt to puff a poor thing because it was in the right direction, or damn a vigorous piece of work because it wasn't. I tackled the man and had it out with him. Our pay was good enough for that to matter a good deal. Our distinctive little blue and white poster kept up its neat, persistent appeal to the public eye, and before 1911 was out, the Blue Weekly was printing 20 pages of publishers' advertisements and went into all the clubs in London and 3/4 of the country houses where weekend parties gather together. Its sale by newsagents and bookstalls grew steadily. One got more and more the reassuring sense of being discussed and influencing discussion. 5. Our office was at the very top of a building near the end of Adelphi Terrace. The main window beside my desk, a big undivided window of plate glass, looked out upon Cleopatra's Needle, the corner of the Hotel Cecil, the fine arches of Waterloo Bridge, and the long sweep of South Bank, with its shot towers and chimneys, past Bankside to the dimly seen piers of the great bridge below the tower. The dome of St. Paul's just floated into view on the left against the hotel facade. By night and day, in every light and atmosphere, it was a beautiful and various view, alive as a throbbing heart. A perpetual flow of traffic ploughed and splashed the streaming silver of the river, and by night the shapes of things became velvet black and grey, and the water a shining mirror of steel, wearing coruscating gems of light. In the foreground, the embankment trams sailed glowing by. Across the water advertisements flashed and flickered. Trains went and came, and a rolling drift of smoke reflected unseen fires. By day, that spectacle was sometimes a marvel of shining wet and wind-cleared atmosphere, sometimes a mystery of drifting fog, sometimes a miracle of crowded details, minutely fine. As I think of that view, so variously spacious in effect, I am back there, and this sunlit paper might be lamplit and lying on my old desk. I see it all again, feel it all again. In the foreground is a green-shaded lamp and crumpled galley slips and paged proofs and letters, 2 or 3 papers in manuscript, and so forth. In the shadows are chairs and another table bearing papers and books, a rotating bookcase dimly seen, a long window seat black in the darkness, and then the cool, unbroken spectacle of the window. How often I would watch some tramcar, some string of barges go from me slowly out of sight. The people were black animalculae by day, clustering, collecting, dispersing by night. They were phantom-faced specks, coming, vanishing, stirring obscurely between light and shade. I recall many hours at my desk in that room before the crisis came, hours full of the peculiar happiness of effective, strenuous work. Once some piece of writing went on, holding me intent and forgetful of time until I looked up from the warm circle of my electric lamp to see the eastward sky above the pale silhouette of the Tower Bridge, flushed and banded brightly with the dawn. Chapter 4. The Besetting of Sex. 1. Art is selection, and so is most autobiography. But I am concerned with a more tangled business than selection. I want to show a contemporary man in relation to the state and social usage, and the social organism in relation to that man. To tell my story at all, I have to simplify. I have given now the broad lines of my political development, and how I passed from my initial liberal socialism to the conception of a constructive aristocracy. I have tried to set that out in the form of a man discovering himself. Incidentally, that self-development led to a profound breach with my wife. One has read stories before of husband and wife speaking severally 2 different languages and coming to an understanding. But Margaret and I began in her dialect, and as I came more and more to use my own, diverged. I had thought when I married that the matter of womankind had ended for me. I have tried to tell all that sex and women had been to me up to my married life with Margaret and our fatal entanglement, tried to show the queer, crippled, embarrassed and limited way in which these interests break upon the life of a young man under contemporary conditions. I do not think my lot was a very exceptional one. I missed the chance of sisters and girl playmates. But that is not an uncommon misadventure in an age of small families. I never came to know any woman at all intimately until I was married to Margaret. My earlier love affairs were encounters of sex under conditions of furtiveness and adventure that made them things in themselves, restricted and unilluminating. From a boyish disposition to be mystical and worshipping towards women, I had passed into a disregardful attitude, as though women were things inferior or irrelevant, disturbers in great affairs. For a time Margaret had blotted out all other women. She was so different and so near. She was like a person who stands suddenly in front of a little window through which one has been surveying a crowd. She didn't become womankind for me so much as eliminate womankind from my world. And then came this secret separation. Until this estrangement and the rapid and uncontrollable development of my relations with Isabel which chanced to follow it, I seemed to have solved the problem of women by marriage and disregard. I thought these things were over. I went about my career with Margaret beside me, her brow slightly knit, her manner faintly strenuous, helping, and, if we had not altogether abolished sex, we had at least so circumscribed and isolated it that it would not have affected the general tenor of our lives in the slightest degree if we had. And then, clothing itself more and more in the form of Isabel and her problems, this fundamental obsession of my life returned. The thing stole upon my mind so that I was unaware of its invasion and how it was changing our long intimacy. I have already compared the lot of the modern publicist to Machiavelli writing in his study. In his day, women and sex were as disregarded in these high affairs as, let us say, the chemistry of air or the will of the beasts in the fields. In ours the case has altogether changed, and women has come now to stand beside the tall candles, half in the light, half in the mystery of the shadows, besetting, interrupting, demanding unrelentingly an altogether unprecedented attention. I feel that in these matters my life has been almost typical of my time. Woman insists upon her presence. She is no longer a mere physical need, an aesthetic byplay, a sentimental background. She is a moral and intellectual necessity in a man's life. She comes to the politician and demands, is she a child or a citizen? Is she a thing or a soul? She comes to the individual man as she came to me and asks, is she a cherished weakling or an equal mate, an unavoidable helper? Is she to be tried and trusted or guarded and controlled, bond or free? For if she is a mate, one must at once trust more and exact more, exacting toil, courage, and the hardest, most necessary thing of all, the clearest, most shameless explicitness of understanding. 2. In all my earlier imaginings of statecraft, I had tacitly assumed either that the relations of the sexes were all right, or that anyhow they didn't concern the state. It was a matter they, whoever they were, had to settle among themselves. That sort of disregard was possible then. But even before 1906, there were endless intimations that the dams holding back great reservoirs of discussion were crumbling. We political schemers were ploughing wider than anyone had ploughed before in the field of social reconstruction. We had also, we realized, to plough deeper. We had to plough down at last to the passionate elements of sexual relationship and examine and decide upon them. The signs multiplied. In a year or so, half the police of the metropolis were scarce sufficient to protect the house from one clamorous aspect of the new problem. The members went about Westminster with an odd, new sense of being beset. A good proportion of us kept up the pretense that the vote for women was an isolated fad, and the agitation and epidemic madness that would presently pass. But it was manifest to anyone who sought more than comfort in the matter that the streams of women and sympathizers and money forthcoming marked far deeper and wider things than an idle fancy for the franchise. The existing laws and conventions of relationship between man and woman were just as unsatisfactory a disorder as anything else in our tumbled confusion of a world, and that also was coming to bear upon statecraft. My first Parliament was the Parliament of the Suffragettes. I don't propose to tell here of that amazing campaign, with its absurdities and follies, its courage and devotion. There were aspects of that unquenchable agitation that were absolutely heroic, and aspects that were absolutely pitiful. It was unreasonable, unwise, and, except for its one central insistence, astonishingly incoherent. It was amazingly effective. The very incoherence of the demand witnessed, I think, to the forces that lay behind it. It wasn't a simple argument based on a simple assumption. It was the first crude expression of a great mass and mingling of convergent feelings, of a widespread, confused persuasion among modern educated women that the conditions of their relations with men were oppressive, ugly, dishonoring, and had to be altered. They had not merely adopted the vote as a symbol of equality. It was fairly manifest to me that, given it, they meant to use it, and to use it perhaps even vindictively and blindly, as a weapon against many things they had every reason to hate. I remember, with exceptional vividness, that great night early in the session of 1909, when, I think it was, 50 or 60 women went to prison. I had been dining at the Barhams, and Lord Barham and I came down from the direction of St. James's Park into a crowd and a confusion outside the Caxton Hall. We found ourselves drifting with an immense multitude towards Parliament Square, and parallel with a silent, close-packed column of girls and women, for the most part white-faced and intent. I still remember the effect of their faces upon me. It was quite different from the general effect of staring about and divided attention one gets in a political procession of men. There was an expression of heroic tension. There had been a pretty deliberate appeal on the part of the women's organizers to the unemployed, who had been demonstrating throughout that winter, to join forces with the movement, and the result was shown in the quality of the crowd upon the pavement. It was an ugly, dangerous-looking crowd, but as yet good-tempered and sympathetic. When at last we got within the sight of the house, the square was a seething seat of excited people, and the array of police on horse and on foot might have been assembled for a revolutionary outbreak. There were dense masses of people up Whitehall and right onto Westminster Bridge. The scuffle that ended in the arrests was the poorest explosion to follow such stupendous preparations. 3. Later on in that year, the women began a new attack. Day and night, and all through the long nights of the budget sittings, at all the piers of the gates of New Palace Yard and at St. Stephen's Porch, stood women pickets, and watched us silently and reproachfully as we went to and fro. They were women of all sorts, though, of course, the independent working class predominated. There were grey-headed old ladies standing there, sturdily charming in the rain, battered-looking, ambiguous women, with something of the desperate bitterness of battered women showing in their eyes, North Country factory girls, cheaply dressed suburban women, trim, comfortable mothers of families, valiant-eyed girl graduates and undergraduates, lank, hungry-looking creatures, who stirred one's imagination. One very dainty little woman in deep mourning, I recall, grave and steadfast, with eyes fixed on distant things. Some of those women looked defiant, some timidly aggressive, some full of the stir of adventure, some drooping with cold and fatigue. The supply never ceased. I had a mortal fear that somehow the supply might halt or cease. I found that continual siege of the legislature extraordinarily impressive, infinitely more impressive than the feeble, forcible ragging of the more militant section. I thought of the appeal that must be going through the country, summoning the women from countless scattered homes, rooms, colleges to Westminster. I remember, too, the petty little difficulty I felt whether I should ignore these pickets altogether, or lift a hat as I hurried past with averted eyes, or look them in the face as I did so. Towards the end, the House evoked an etiquette of salutation. 4. There was a tendency, even on the part of its sympathizers, to treat the whole suffrage agitation as if it were a disconnected issue, irrelevant to all other broad developments of social and political life. We struggled, all of us, to ignore the indicating finger it thrust out before us. Your schemes, for all their bigness, it insisted to our reluctant, averted minds, still don't go down to the essential things. We have to go deeper, or our inadequate children's insufficient children will starve amidst harvests of earless futility. That conservatism, which works in every class to preserve in its essentials the habitual daily life, is all against a profounder treatment of political issues. The politician, almost as absurdly as the philosopher, tends constantly, in spite of magnificent preludes, vast intimations, to specialize himself out of the reality he has so stupendously summoned. He bolts back to littleness. The world has to be moulded anew, he continues to admit, but without, he adds, any risk of upsetting his week-end visits, his morning cup of tea. The discussion of the relations of men and women disturbs everyone. It reacts upon the private life of everyone who attempts it, and at any particular time only a small minority have a personal interest in changing the established state of affairs. Habit and interest are in a constantly recruited majority against conscious change and adjustment in these matters. Drift rules us. The great mass of people, and an overwhelming proportion of influential people, are people who have banished their dreams and made their compromise. Wonderful and beautiful possibilities are no longer to be thought about. They have given up any aspirations for intense love. Their splendid offspring, for keen delights, have accepted a cultivated kindness and an uncritical sense of righteousness as their compensation. It's a settled affair with them, a settled, dangerous affair. Most of them fear and many hate the slightest reminder of those abandoned dreams. As Dayton once said to the Pentagram Circle, when we are discussing the problem of a universal marriage and divorce law throughout the empire, I am for leaving all these things alone. And then, with a groan in his voice, leave them alone. Leave them alone. That was his whole speech for the evening, in a note of suppressed passion, and presently, against all our etiquette, he got up and went out. For some years after my marriage, I too was for leaving them alone. I developed a dread and dislike for romance, for emotional music, for the human figure in art, turning my heart to landscape. I wanted to sneer at lovers and their ecstasies, and was uncomfortable until I found the effective sneer. In matters of private morals, these were my most uncharitable years. I didn't want to think of these things any more forever. I hated the people whose talk or practice showed they were not of my opinion. I wanted to believe that their views were immoral and objectionable and contemptible, because I had decided to treat them at that level. I was, in fact, falling into the attitude of the normal, decent man. And yet one cannot help thinking, the sensible, moralized man finds it hard to escape the stream of suggestion that there are still dreams beyond these commonplace acquiescences, the appeal of beauty suddenly shining upon one, the moth-like stirrings of serene summer nights, the sweetness of distant music. It is one of the paradoxical factors in our public life at the present time. which penalizes abandonment to love so abundantly and so heavily that power, influence, and control fall largely to unencumbered people and sterile people and people who have married for passionless purposes, people whose very deficiency in feeling has left them free to follow ambition, people beauty blind, who don't understand what it is to fall in love, what it is to desire children or have them, what it is to feel in their blood and bodies the supreme claim of good births and selective births above all other affairs in life. People, almost of necessity, averse from this most fundamental aspect of existence. 5. It wasn't, however, my deepening sympathy with and understanding of the position of women in general, or the change in my ideas about all these intimate things my fast friendship with Isabel was bringing about, that led me to the heretical views I have in the last 5 years dragged from the region of academic and timid discussion into the field of practical politics. These influences, no doubt, have converged to the same end and given me a powerful emotional push upon my road, but it was a broader and colder view of things that first determined me in my attempt to graft the endowment of motherhood in some form or other upon British imperialism. Now that I am exiled from the political world, it is possible to estimate just how effectually that grafting has been done. I have explained how the ideas of a trained aristocracy and a universal education grew to paramount importance in my political scheme. It is but a short step from this to the question of the quantity and quality of births in the community, and from that again to these forbidden and fear-beset topics of marriage, divorce, and the family organization. A sporadic discussion of these aspects has been going on for years. A eugenic society existed, and articles on the falling birth rate and the rapid multiplication of the unfit were staples of the monthly magazines. But beyond an intermittent scolding of prosperous childless people in general, one never addressed them in particular. Nothing was done towards arresting those adverse processes. Almost against my natural inclination, I found myself forced to go into these things. I came to the conclusion that under modern conditions the isolated private family, based on the existing marriage contract, was failing in its work. It wasn't producing enough children, and children good enough and well trained enough for the demands of the developing civilized state. Our civilization was growing outwardly and decaying in its intimate substance, and unless it was presently to collapse, some very extensive and courageous reorganization was needed. The old haphazard system of pairing, qualified more and more by worldly discretions, no longer secures a young population numerous enough or good enough for the growing needs and possibilities of our empire. Statecraft sits weaving splendid garments, no doubt, but with a puny, ugly, insufficient baby in the cradle. No one so far has dared to take up this problem as a present question for statecraft, but it comes unheralded, unadvocated, and sits at every legislative board. Every improvement is provisional except the improvement of the race, and it became more and more doubtful to me if we were improving the race at all. Splendid and beautiful and courageous people must come together and have children. Women with their fine senses and glorious devotion must be freed from the net that compels them to be celibate, compels them to be childless and useless, or to bear children ignobly to men whom need and ignorance and the treacherous pressure of circumstances have forced upon them. We all know that, and so few dare even to whisper it for fear that they should seem, in seeking to save the family, to threaten its existence. It is as if a party of pygmies in a not too capacious room had been joined by a carnivorous giant and decided to go on living happily by cutting him dead. The problem of the developing civilized state has to solve is how can it get the best possible increase under the best possible conditions. I became more and more convinced that the independent family unit of today in which the man is master of the wife and the owner of the children, in which all are dependent upon him, subordinated to his enterprises, and liable to follow his fortunes up or down, does not supply anything like the best conceivable conditions. We want to modernize the family footing altogether. An enormous premium both in pleasure and competitive efficiency is put upon voluntary childlessness, and enormous inducements are held out to women to subordinate instinctive and selective preferences to social and material considerations. The practical reaction of modern conditions upon the old tradition of the family is this: that beneath the pretense that nothing is changing, secretly and with all the unwholesomeness of secrecy, everything is changed. Offspring fall away, the birth rate falls, and falls most among just the most efficient and active and best adapted classes in the community. The species is recruited from among its failures and from among less civilized aliens. Contemporary civilizations are, in effect, burning the best of their possible babies in the furnaces that run the machinery. In the United States, the native Anglo-American strain has scarcely increased at all since 1830, and in most Western European countries the same is probably true of the ablest and most energetic elements of the community. The women of these classes still remain legally and practically dependent and protected, with the only natural excuse for their dependence gone. The modern world becomes an immense spectacle of unsatisfactory groupings. Here, childless couples bored to death in the hopeless effort to sustain an incessant honeymoon. Here, homes in which a solitary child grows unsocially. Here, small 2 or 3 child homes that do no more than continue the culture of the parents at a great social cost. Here, numbers of unhappy, educated but childless married women. Here, careless, decivilized, fecund homes. Here, orphanages and asylums for the heedlessly begotten. It is just the disorderly proliferation of Bromstead over again, in lives instead of in houses. What is the good, what is the common sense of rectifying boundaries, pushing research and discovery, building cities, improving all the facilities of life, making great fleets, waging wars, while this aimless decadence remains the quality of the biological outlook? It is difficult now to trace how I changed from my earlier version until I faced this mass of problems. But so far back as 1910, I had it clear in my mind that I would rather fail utterly than participate in all the surrenders of mind and body that are implied in Dayton's snarl of "leave it alone, leave it alone." Marriage and the begetting and care of children is the very ground substance in the life of the community. In a world in which everything changes, in which fresh methods, fresh adjustments, and fresh ideas perpetually renew the circumstances of life, it is preposterous that we should not even examine into these matters, should rest content to be ruled by the uncriticized traditions of a barbaric age. Now, it seems to me that the solution of this problem is also the solution of the women's individual problem. The two go together, are right and left of one question. The only conceivable way out from our impasse lies in the recognition of parentage, that is to say, of adequate mothering, as no longer a chance product of individual passions, but a service rendered to the state. Women must become less and less subordinated to individual men, since this works out in a more or less complete limitation, waste, and sterilization of their essentially social function. They must become more and more subordinated as individually independent citizens to the collective purpose. Or, to express the thing by a familiar phrase, the highly organized scientific state we desire must, if it is to exist at all, base itself not upon the irresponsible man-ruled family, but upon the matriarchal family, the citizenship and freedom of women, and the public endowment of motherhood. After 2 generations of confused and experimental revolt, it grows clear to modern women that a conscious, deliberate motherhood and a mothering is their special function in the state, and that a personal subordination to an individual man with an unlimited power of control over this intimate and supreme duty is a degradation. No contemporary woman of education put to the test is willing to recognize any claim a man can make upon her but the claim of her freely given devotion to him. She wants the reality of her choice, and she means family, while a man too often means only possession. This alters the spirit of the family relationships fundamentally. Their form remains just what it was when woman was esteemed a pretty, desirable, and incidentally a child-producing chattel. Against these time-honored ideas, the new spirit of womanhood struggles in shame, astonishment, bitterness, and tears. I confess myself altogether feminist. I have no doubts in the matter. I want this coddling and browbeating of women to cease. I want to see women come in, free and fearless, to a full participation in the collective purpose of mankind. Women, I am convinced, are as fine as men. They can be as wise as men. They are capable of far greater devotion than men. I want to see them citizens with a marriage law framed primarily for them and for their protection and for the good of the race and not for man's satisfactions. I want to see them bearing and rearing good children in the state as a generously rewarded public duty and service, choosing their husbands freely and discerningly, and in no way enslaved or subordinated to the men they have chosen. The social consciousness of women seems to me an unworked and almost untouched mine of wealth for the constructive purpose of the world. I want to change the respective values of the family group altogether and make the home indeed the women's kingdom, and the mother the owner and responsible guardian of her children. It is no use pretending that this is not novel and revolutionary. It is. The endowment of motherhood implies a new method of social organization, a rearrangement of the social unit, untried in human experience, as untried as electric traction was or flying in 1800. Of course, it may work out to modify men's ideas of marriage profoundly. To me, that is a secondary consideration. I do not believe that particular assertion myself, because I am convinced that a practical monogamy is a psychological necessity to the mass of civilized people. But even if I did believe, it should still keep to my present line, because it is the only line that will prevent a highly organized civilization from ending in biological decay. The public endowment of motherhood is the only possible way which will ensure the permanently developing civilized state at which all constructive minds are aiming. A point is reached in the life history of a civilization when either this reconstruction must be effected or the quality and morale of the population prove insufficient for the needs of the developing organization. It is not so much moral decadence that will destroy us as moral inadaptability. The old code fails under the new needs. The only alternative to this profound reconstruction is a decay in human quality and social collapse. Either this unprecedented rearrangement must be achieved by our civilization, or it must presently come upon a phase of disorder and crumble and perish, as Rome perished, as France declines, as the strain of the Pilgrim Fathers dwindles out of America. Whatever hope there may be in the attempt, therefore, there is no alternative to the attempt. 6. I wanted political success now dearly enough, but not at the price of constructive realities. These questions were no doubt monstrously dangerous in the political world. There wasn't a politician alive who didn't look scared at the mention of the family. But if raising these issues were essential to the social reconstructions on which my life was set, that did not matter. It only implied that I should take them up with deliberate caution. There was no release because of risk or difficulty. The question of whether I should commit myself to some open project in this direction was going on in my mind concurrently with my speculations about a change of party, like bass and treble in a complex piece of music. The two drew to a conclusion together. I would not only go over to imperialism, but I would attempt to biologize imperialism. I thought at first that I was undertaking a monstrous uphill task. But as I came to look into the possibilities of the matter, a strong persuasion grew up in my mind that this panic fear of legislative proposals affecting the family basis was excessive, that things were much riper for development in this direction than old experienced people out of touch with the younger generation imagined, that to phrase the thing in a parliamentary fashion, something might be done in the constituencies, with the endowment of motherhood forthwith, provided only that it was made perfectly clear that anything a sane person could possibly intend by morality was left untouched by these proposals. I went to work very carefully. I got Roper of the Daily Telephone and Burkitt of the Dial to try over a silly season discussion of state help for mothers, and I put a series of articles on eugenics, upon the fall in the birth rate, and similar topics in the Blue Weekly, leading up to a tentative and generalized advocacy of the public endowment of the nation's children. I was more and more struck by the acceptance won by a sober and restrained presentation of this suggestion. And then, in the 4th year of the Blue Weekly's career, came the Handitch election, and I was forced by the clamour of my antagonist, and very willingly forced, to put my convictions to the test. I returned triumphantly to Westminster, with the public endowment of motherhood as part of my open profession and with the full approval of the party press. Applauding benches of imperialists cheered me on my way to the table between the whips. The second time I took the oath, I was not one of a crowd of new members, but salient, an event, a symbol of profound changes and new purposes in the national life. Here it is my political book comes to an end, and in a sense my book ends altogether. For the rest is but to tell how I was swept out of this great world of political possibilities. I close this third book as I opened it, with an admission of difficulties and complexities, but now with a pile of manuscript before me, I have to confess them unsurmounted and still entangled. Yet my aim was a final simplicity. I have sought to show my growing realization that the essential quality of all political and social effort is the development of a great race mind behind the interplay of individual lives. That is the collective human reality, the basis of morality, the purpose of devotion. To that our lives must be given, from that will come the perpetual fresh release and further ennoblement of individual lives. I have wanted to make that idea of a collective mind play in this book the part united Italy plays in Machiavelli's Prince. I have called it the hinterland of reality, shown it accumulating a dominating truth and rightness which must force men's now sporadic motives more and more into a disciplined and understanding relation to a plan. And I have tried to indicate how I sought to serve this great clarification of our confusions. Now I come back to personality and the story of my self-betrayal, and how it is I have had to leave all that far-reaching scheme of mine, a mere project, and beginning for other men to take or leave as it pleases them.